This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real events or persons is purely coincidental. This story is purely fictional and does not promote or encourage any form of violence. If we're leaving as soon as that, I should go see Arcadius about that meal he promised, Hadrian said.
No,
Arista told them hastily. They looked at her, surprised. She smiled, embarrassed by her outburst. I'll go. It'll give you two a chance to change out of your wet things without me here. Before they could say anything, she slipped out and down the hallway to the stairs. It had been nearly a year since that morning on the bank of the Nidwalden River, when Ezra Harden had put a question in her head. The wizard had admitted using her to orchestrate the murder of her father to facilitate his escape. But he had also suggested there was more to the story. This could be her only chance to speak with Arcadius. She took a right at the bottom of the stairs and hurried to his study. Arcadius sat on a stool at a small wooden desk on the far side of the room, studying a page of a massive tome. Beside him was a brazier of hot coals and an odd contraption she had never seen before. A brown liquid hung suspended above the heat of the brazier in a glass vial, as a steady stream of bubbles rose from a small stone, immersed in the liquid. The steamy vapors rose through a series of glass tubes and passed through another glass container filled with salt crystals. From the end of that tube, a clear fluid slowly dripped into a small flask. A yellow liquid also hung suspended above the flask, and through a valve, one yellow drop fell for each clear one. As these two liquids mixed, white smoke silently rose into the air. Occasionally he adjusted a valve, added salt, or pumped bellows, causing the charcoal to grow red hot. At her entrance, Arcadius looked up. He removed his glasses, wiped them with a rag from the desk, and put them back on. He peered at her through squinting eyes. "Ah, my dear, come in." Then, as if remembering something important, he hastily twisted one of the valves. A large puff of smoke billowed up, causing several of the animals in the room to chatter. The stone fell to the bottom of the vial, where it lay quietly. The animals calmed down, and the elderly master of lore turned and smiled at Arista, motioning for her to join him. This was no easy feat. Arista searched for open floor to step on, and finding little, grabbed the hem of her robe and opted to step on the sturdiest-looking objects in the shortest path to the desk. The wizard waited patiently with a cheery smile, his high, rosy cheeks causing the edges of his eyes to wrinkle like a bedsheet held in a fist. "You know," he began as she made the perilous crossing, "I always find it interesting what paths my students take to reach me. Some are direct, while others take more of a roundabout approach. Some end up getting lost in the clutter, and others find the journey too much trouble and give up altogether, without even reaching me." Arista was certain he implied more than he said, but she had neither the time nor the inclination to explore it further. Instead, she replied, "Perhaps if you straightened up a bit, you wouldn't lose so many students." The wizard tilted his head. "I suppose you're right, but where would be the fun in that?" Arista stepped over the rabbit cage, around the large pestle and mortar, and stood before the desk on a closed cover of a book no less than 3 feet in height and 2 in width. The loremaster looked down at her feet, pursed his lips, and nodded his approval. "That's Glen Morgan II's biography, easily 700 years old." Arista looked alarmed. "Not to worry, not to worry," he told her, chuckling to himself. "It's a terrible book, written by church propagandists, the perfect platform some for you to stand on, don't you think?" Arista opened her mouth, thought about what she was going to say, and then closed it again. The wizard chuckled some more. Ah, yes. They've gone and made an ambassador out of you, haven't they? You've learned to think before you speak. I suppose that's good. Now tell me, what brings you to my office at this hour? If it's about dinner, I apologize for the delay. But the stoves were out and I needed to fetch a boy to get them fired again. I also had to drag the cook away from a card game, which he wasn't at all pleased about. But a meal is being prepared as we speak, and I'll have it brought up the moment it's finished. It's not that, Master. He put a hand up to stop her. You are no longer a student here. You are a princess and ambassador of Melangar. If you call me Arcadius, I won't call you Your Highness. Agreed? The grin of his was just too infectious to fight. She nodded and smiled in return. Arcadius, she began again. I've something on my mind, and I've been meaning to visit you for some time, but so much has been happening. First, there was Fanin's funeral. Then, of course, Thomas arrived in Melangar. Oh yes, the wandering deacon of Dahlgren. He came here as well, preaching that a young girl named Thrace is the heir of Novron. He sounded very sincere. Even I was inclined to believe him. A lot of people did, and that's part of the reason Melangar's fate is so precarious now. Arista stopped. There was someone at the door. A pretty girl, perhaps 6 years old. Long dark hair spilled over her shoulders, and her hands were clasped together, holding a length of thin rope that she played with, spinning it in circles. Ah, there you are. Good, the wizard told the girl, who stared apprehensively at Arista. I was hoping you'd turn up soon. He's starting to cause a fuss. It's as if he can tell time. Arcadius glanced at Arista. Oh, forgive me. I neglected to introduce you. Arista, this is Mercy. How do you do? Arista asked. The little girl said nothing. You must forgive her. She's a bit shy with strangers. A bit young for Sheridan, isn't she? Arcadius smiled. Mercy is my ward. Her mother asked me to watch over her for a while, until her situation improved. Until then, I try my best to educate her. But as I learned with you, young ladies can be most willful. He turned to the girl. Go right ahead, dear. Take Mr. Rings outside with you before he rips up his cage again. The girl moved across the room's debris as nimbly as a cat and removed a thin raccoon from his cage. He was a baby, by the look of it, and she carried him out the door, giggling as Mr. Rings sniffed her ear. She's cute, Arista said. Indeed she is. Now you said you had something on your mind. Arista nodded and considered her words. The question Ezra Harden had planted, she now presented to her old teacher. Arcadius, who approved my entrance into Sheridan? The lawmaster raised a bristled eyebrow. Ah, he said. You know, I always wondered why you never asked before. You are perhaps the only female to attend Sheridan University in its 700-year history, and certainly the only one to study the arcane arts at all. But you never questioned it once. Arista's posture tightened. I'm questioning it now. Indeed, indeed, the wizard replied. He sat back, removed his glasses, and rubbed his nose briefly. I was visited by Chancellor Ignatius Lambert and asked if I would be willing to accept a gifted young lady into my instructions on arcane theory. This surprised me. You see, I didn't teach a class on arcane theory. I'd wanted to, and I requested to have it added to the curriculum on many occasions. But I was always turned down by the school's patrons. It seemed they didn't feel that teaching magic was a respectable pursuit. Magic uses power not connected to a spiritual devotion to Maribor and Navron. At best, it was subversive and possibly outright evil in their minds. The fact that I practiced the arcane arts at all has always been an embarrassment. Why haven't they replaced you? It could be that my reputation as the most learned wizard in Avren lends such prestige to this school that they allow me my hobbies. Or it may be that anyone who has tried to force my resignation has been turned into the various toads, squirrels, and rabbits you see about you. He appeared so serious that Arista looked around the room at the various cages and aquariums, at which point the wizard began to chuckle. She scowled at him, which only made him laugh harder. As I was saying, Arcadius went on once he regained control of himself. Ignatius was in one sentence offering me my desire to teach magic if I was willing to accept you as a student. Perhaps he thought I would refuse. Little did he know that unlike the rest of them, I harbor no prejudices concerning women. Knowledge is knowledge, and the chance to instruct and enlighten a princess, a potential leader with the power to help shape the world around us, was not a deterrent at all. On the contrary, I saw it as a bonus. So you're saying I was allowed entrance because of a plan of the school's headmaster that backfired? Not at all. That is merely how it happened, not why. Why is a much more important question. You see, School Chancellor Ignatius Lambert was not alone in my office that morning. With him was another man. He remained silent and stood over there, just behind and to the left of you where the bird cage is now. The cage wasn't there then, of course. Instead, he chose to stand on a discarded old coat and a dagger. As I mentioned, it's always interesting to see the paths people take when they enter this office and where they choose to stand. Who was he? Percy Braga, the Archduke of Melangar. So it was Uncle Percy. He certainly was involved, but even an Archduke of Melangar wasn't likely to have influence over those running Sheridan University, especially on a matter as volatile as teaching magic to young noble ladies. Sheridan is in the ecclesiastical realm of Ghent, where secular lords have no sway. There was, however, another man with them. He never entered my office but stood in the doorway, in the shadows. Could you tell who it was? Oh, yes, Arcadius smiled. These are reading glasses, my dear. I can see long distances just fine, but then I can see that is a common mistake people make. Who was it then? A close friend of your family, I believe. Bishop Maurice Soldur of Melangar's Mayor's Cathedral. But you probably knew that, didn't you? Good to his word, Arcadius sent steaming meat pies and red wine. Arista recalled the pies from her days as a student. They were never very good, even when fresh. Usually they were made from the worst cuts of pork, because the school saved lamb for the holidays. The pies were heavy on onions and carrots and thin on gravy and meat. Students actually gambled on how many poultry shreds of pork they would find in their pies. A mere 5 stood as the record. Despite their complaints, the other students wolfed down their meals, but she never had. Most of the other students' indignation, she guessed, was only bluster. They likely ate no better at home. Arista, however, was accustomed to 3 or 4 different meats roasted on the bone, several varieties of cheese, freshly baked breads, and whatever fruits were in season. To get her through the week, she had servants bring deliveries from home, which she had kept in her room. You could have mentioned that you knew Arcadius, Arista told them as they sat down together at the common table. An old bit of furniture defaced like everything else. It wobbled enough to make her glad the wine was in a jug with cups instead of a bottle and subemmed glasses. And ruined the fun, Hadrian replied with a handsome grin. So Arcadius was your professor? One of them? The curriculum requires you to take several classes learning different subjects from the various teachers. Master Arcadius was my favorite. He was the only one to teach magic. So you learned magic from Arcadius as well as Ezra Harden? Royce asked, digging into his pie. Arista nodded, poking her pie with her knife and letting the steam out. That must have been interesting. I'm guessing their teaching styles were a bit different. Like night and day. She took a sip of wine. Arcadius was formal in his lessons. He followed a very structured course, using books and lecturing very professorially, like you saw this evening. His style made the lesson seem right and proper, despite the stigma associated with them. Ezra Harden was haphazard. He seemed to teach whatever came to his mind. Oftentimes he had trouble explaining things. Arcadius is clearly the better teacher, but... She paused. But? Royce asked. Well, don't tell Arcadius, she said conspiratorially. But Ezra Harden seems to be the more skilled and knowledgeable. Arcadius is the expert on the history of magic, but Ezra Harden is the history, if you follow me. She took a bite of pie and got a mouthful of onions and burnt crust. Having learned from both, doesn't that make you the third most skilled mage in Avran? Arista smirked bitterly and washed the mouthful down with more wine. While she suspected Royce was correct, she'd cast only 2 spells since leaving their tutelage. Arcadius taught me many important lessons, yet his classes concerned themselves with using knowledge as a means to broaden his students' understanding of their world. It's his way of getting us to think in new directions, to perceive what is about us in terms that are more sensible. Of course, this didn't make his students happy. We all wanted the secrets to power, the tools to reshape the world to our liking. Arcadius doesn't really give answers, but rather focuses his students to ask questions. For instance, he once asked us what makes noble blood different from a commoner's blood. We pricked our fingers and ran tests, and as it turns out, there is no detectable difference. This led to a fight on the commons between a wealthy merchant's son and the son of a low-ranking baron. Master Arcadius was reprimanded, and the merchant's son was whipped. Hadrian had finished eating, and Royce was more than halfway through his pie, but he'd left his wine untouched after grimacing with the first sip. Arista chanced another bite and caught a mushy carrot, still more onions, and a soggy bit of crust. She swallowed with a sour look. Not a fan of meat pie? Hadrian asked. She shook her head. You can have it if you like. She slid it over. So, how was studying with Ezra Harden? He was a completely different story. She went on after another mouthful of wine. When I couldn't get what I wanted from Arcadius, I went to see him. You see, all of Arcadius's teachings involve elaborate preparations, alchemic recipes that are used to trigger the release of nature's powers, and incantations to focus it. He also stressed observation and experimentation to tap the power of the natural world. Arcadius relied on manual techniques to derive power from the elements, but Ezra Harden explained how the same energy could be summoned through more subtle enticements, using only motion, harmonic sound, and the power of the mind. The problem was Ezra Harden's technique relied on hand movements, which explains why the church cut his off. He tried to talk me through the motions, but without the ability to demonstrate, it was very frustrating. Subtle differences can separate success from failure, so learning from him was hopeless. All I ever managed to do was make a man sneeze. Oh, and once I cursed Countess Averell with boils. Hadrian poured the last of the wine into his and Arista's cups after Royce waved them off. Arcadius was angry when he found out about the curse and lectured me for hours. He was always against using magic for personal gain or for the betterment of just a few. He often said, "Don't waste energy to treat a single plague victim. Instead, search to eliminate the illness and save thousands. So yes, you're right. I'm likely the most tutored mage in all Avron. But that's really not saying much. I would be hard-pressed to do much more than tickle someone's nose. And you can do that just with hand movements? Royce asked skeptically. Would you like a demonstration? Sure. Try it on Hadrian. No. Let's not, Hadrian protested. I don't want to be accidentally turned into a toad, a rabbit, or something. Didn't you learn anything else? Well, he tried to teach me how to boil water, but I never got it to work. I would get close, but there was always something missing. He used to. She trailed off. What? Hadrian asked. She shrugged. I don't know. It's just that I was practicing gestures on the ride here, and She squinted in concentration as she ran through the sequence in her mind. They should be similar. Both the rain and the boiling spell used the same element, water. The same motion should be found in each. Just thinking about it made her heart quicken. That is it, isn't it? That is the missing piece. If I have the rest of the spell correct, then all I need to do is... Looking around for the bucket that Hadrian had brought up, she closed her eyes and took several deep breaths. Boiling water. While harder than making a person sneeze, it took a short, simple incantation. One she had attempted without success hundreds of times. She cleared her mind, relaxed, then reached out, sensing the room. The light and heat emanating from the candles, the force of the wind blowing above the roof, the dripping of water from their wet clothes. She opened her eyes and focused on the bucket and the water inside. Lukewarm, it lay quiet, sleeping. She felt its place in the world, part of the whole, waiting for a change, wanting to please. Arista began to hum, letting the sounds follow the rhythm that spoke to the water. She sensed its attention. Her voice rose, speaking the few short words in the melody of a song. She raised a single hand and made the motions. Only this time, she added a simple sweep of her thumb. It felt perfect, the hold that evaded her in the past. She closed her hand into a fist and squeezed. The moment she did, she could feel the heat, and across the room, steam rose. Hadrian stood up, took 2 steps, and then stopped. It's bubbling, he said, his voice expressing his amazement. Yeah, and so are our clothes. Royce pointed to the pieces of wet clothing hanging on the line, which were beginning to hiss as steam rose from them. Oops. Arista opened her hand abruptly. The wash water stopped boiling, and the clothes quieted. By Ma, that's unbelievable. Hadrian stood grinning. You really did it. Royce remained silent, staring at the steaming clothes. I know. Can you believe it? She said. What else can you do? Let's not find out, Royce interrupted. It's getting late and we'll be leaving in a few hours, so we should get to sleep. Killjoy, Hadrian replied, but he's probably right. Let's turn in. Arista nodded, walked behind the wall of blankets, and only then allowed herself a smile. It worked. It really worked. Lying on the little cot without bothering with a blanket, she stared at the ceiling and listened to the thieves moving about. You have to admit, that was impressive, she heard Hadrian say. If Royce made a reply, she didn't hear it. She had frightened him. The expression on his face had said more than words ever could. Lying there, looking up at the rafters, she realized she had seen that look before. The day Arcadius had reprimanded her. She had been leaving his office when he had stopped her. I never taught courses in this class, boils or otherwise. Did you cause them by mixing a draft that she drank? No, she recalled saying. It was a verbal curse. His eyes widened, and his mouth gaped. But he said nothing more. At the time, she had thought his look was one of amazement and pride in a student exceeding expectations. Looking back, Arista realized she had seen only what she had wanted to see. Chapter 6. The Word. As Emilia watched, the playful flicker of candlelight caught the attention of the Empress, which briefly replaced her blank stare. Is that a sign? Emilia often played this game with herself, looking for any improvement. A month had passed since Saldor had summoned her to his office to explain her duties. She knew she could never do half of what he wanted, but his main concern was the Empress's health, and Emilia was doing well in that regard. Even in this faint light, she could see the change. Modena's cheeks were no longer hollow, her skin no longer stretched. The Empress was now eating some vegetables and even bits of meat hidden in the soup. Still, Emilia feared the progress wouldn't be good enough. Modena still had not said a word, at least not while awake. Often when the Empress slept, she mumbled, moaned, and tossed about restlessly. Upon awakening, the girl cried, tears running down her cheeks. Emilia held her, stroked her hair, and tried to keep her warm. But the Empress didn't seem to notice her presence. To pass the time, Emilia continued to tell Modena stories, hoping it might prompt her into speaking, perhaps to ask a question. After telling her everything she could think of about her family, she moved on to fairy tales from her childhood. There was Grunbach, the evil dwarf who kidnapped a milkmaid and imprisoned her in his subterranean lair. The maiden solved the riddle of the 3 boxes, snipped off his beard, and escaped. She even recounted scary stories told by her brothers in the dark of the carriage workshop. She knew they'd been purposefully trying to frighten her, and even now the tales gave Emilia chills. But anything was worth a try to snap Modena back to the land of the living. The most disturbing of these were about elves, who put their victims to sleep with music before eating them. When she ran out of fairy tales, she turned to stories she remembered from church, like the epic tale of how, in their hour of greatest need, Maribor sent the divine Novron to save mankind. Wielding the wondrous Relicon, he defeated the elves. Thinking Modena would like the similarities to her own life, Emilia told the romantic account of the farmer's daughter, Persephone, whom Novron took to be his queen. When she refused to leave her simple village, he built the great imperial capital right there and named the city Persequicus after her. "So what story shall we have this evening?" Emilia asked as the 2 girls lay across from each other, bathed in the light of the candles. "How about Kyle and the White Feather? Our Monsignor used it from time to time when he wanted to make a point about penance and redemption. Have you heard that one? Do you like it?" "I do. Well, you see, the father of the gods, Erebus, had 3 sons, Ferrol, Drome, and Maribor, the gods of elves, dwarves, and men. He also had a daughter, Muriel, who was the loveliest being ever created, and she held dominion over all the plants and animals. Well, one night Erebus became drunk and raped his own daughter. In anger, her brothers attacked their father and tried to kill him. But of course, gods can't die." Emilia saw the candles flicker from a draught. It was always colder at night, and she got up and brought them each another blanket. "So where was I?" Modena merely blinked. "Oh, I remember." Racked with guilt and grief, Erebus returned to Muriel and begged for her forgiveness. She was moved by her father's remorse, but still couldn't look at him. He pleaded for her to name a punishment. Muriel needed time to let the fear and pain pass, so she told him, "Go to Elan to live, not as a god, but as a man, to learn humility, Getu. To repent for his misdeeds, she charged him to do good works. Erebus did as she requested and took the name of Kyle. It's said that he walks the world of man to this day, working miracles. For each act that pleases her, she bestows a white feather to him from her magnificent robe, which he places in a pouch kept forever by his side. On the day when all the feathers have been awarded, Muriel promised to call her father home and forgive him. The legend says that when the gods are reunited, all will be made right, and the world will transform into a paradise. This really was one of Amelia's favorite stories, and she told it hoping for miraculous results. Perhaps the father of the gods would hear her and come to their aid. Amelia waited. Nothing happened. The walls were the same cold stone, the flickering flames the only light. She sighed. Well, maybe we'll just have to make our own miracles, she told Modena as she blew out all but a single candle, then closed her eyes to sleep. Amelia woke with a newfound purpose. She resolved to free Modena from her room, if only for a short while. The cell reeked of the scent of urine and mildew, which lingered even after scrubbing and fresh straw. She wanted to take Modena outside, but knew that would be asking too much. Amelia tried to convince herself that Lady Constance had been dragged away because of Modena's failing health, and not because she had taken her to the kitchen. But even so, no matter the consequences, Amelia had to try. Amelia changed both herself and Modena into their day clothing and, taking her gently by the hand, led her to the door and knocked. When it opened, she faced the guard, straight and tall, and announced, "I'm taking the Empress to the kitchen for her meal. I was appointed the Imperial Secretary by Regent Saldor himself, and I'm responsible for her care. She can't remain in this filthy cell. It's killing her." She waited. He would refuse, and she would argue. She tried to organize her rebuttals: noxious vapors, the healing power of fresh air, the fact that they would kill her if the Empress didn't show improvement. Why that last one would persuade him, she had not worked out. But it was one of the thoughts pressing on her mind. The guard looked from Amelia to Modena and back to Amelia again. She was shocked when he nodded and stepped aside. Amelia hesitated. She hadn't considered the possibility he would relent. She led the Empress up the steps while the soldier followed. She made no announcement, like Lady Constance. She simply walked in with the Empress in tow, bringing the kitchen once more to a halt. Everyone stared. No one said a word. "The Empress would like her meal," Amelia told Ibis, who nodded. "Could you please put some extra bread at the bottom of the bowl? And could she get some fruit today?" Aye, the big man acknowledged. "Leif, get on it. Nippa, go to the storage and bring up some of those berries. The rest of you, back to work. Nothing to see here." Nippa bolted outside, leaving the door open. Red, one of the huntsman's old dogs, wandered in. Modena dropped Amelia's hand. "Leif, get that animal out of here," Ibis ordered. "Wait," Amelia said. Everyone watched as the Empress knelt down next to the elk-hound. The dog, in turn, nuzzled her. Red was old, and his muzzle had gone gray, and his eyes clouded with blindness. Why the huntsman kept him was a mystery, as all he did was sleep in the courtyard and beg for handouts from the kitchen. Few took notice of his familiar presence, but he commanded the Empress's attention. She scratched behind his ears and stroked his fur. "I guess Red gets to stay," Ibis chuckled. "Dogs got important friends." Edith Mon entered the kitchen, halting abruptly at the sight of Amelia and the Empress. She pursed her lips, narrowed her eyes, and without a word, pivoted and exited the way she had come. Amidst the sound of pounding hammers, Regent Maurice Saldor strode through the palace reception hall, where artisans were busy at work. A year ago, this had been King Ethelred's castle, the stark stone fortress of Avren's most powerful monarch. Since the coronation of the Empress, it had become the imperial palace of the Nephron Empire and the home of the daughter of Meribor. Saldor had insisted on the renovations. A grand new foyer, complete with the crown seal etched in white marble on the floor, several massive chandeliers to lighten the dark interior, a wider, ornate balcony from which Her Eminence could wave to her adoring people, and of course a complete rework of the throne room. Ethelred and the Chancellor had balked at the expense. The new throne cost almost as much as a warship, but they didn't understand the importance of impressions the way Saldor did. He had an illiterate, nearly comatose child for an empress, and the only thing preventing disaster was that no one knew. Saldor's edict restricting servants from leaving the castle had been issued to contain most of the gossip. Brute force, opulence would further the misdirection. How much silk, gold, and marble does it take to blind the world? More than he had access to, he was certain. But he would do what he could. These past few weeks, Saldor had felt as if he had been balancing teacups on his head while standing on a stool strapped to the back of a runaway horse. The new empire had manifested itself in just a matter of weeks. Centuries of planning had finally coalesced, but as with everything, there were mistakes and circumstances for which they could not possibly account. The whole fiasco in Dahlgren had been only the start. The moment they had declared the establishment of the new empire, Glaston had gone into open revolt. Alban had decided to haggle over terms, and of course there was Melangar. The humiliation was beyond words. Every other Avren kingdom had fallen in step as planned, all except his. He had been bishop of Melangar and close personal advisor to the king, as well as the king's son, and yet Melangar remained independent. Saldor's clever solution to the Dahlgren problem had kept him from fading into obscurity. He had drawn victory from ashes, and for that the Patriarch had appointed him the Church's representative, making him co-regent alongside Ethelred. The old king of Warwick maintained the existing systems, but Saldor was the architect of the New World Order. His vision would define the lives of thousands for centuries to come. Although it was a tremendous opportunity, Saldor felt as if he were rolling a massive boulder up a hill. If he should trip or stumble, the rock would roll back and crush him, and everything else with it. When Saldor reached his office, he found Louis Gache waiting. The church sentinel had just arrived, hopefully with good news. The Knight of Nephron waited near the window, as straight and impeccable as ever. He stood looking out at some distant point with his hands clasped behind his back. As usual, he wore the black and scarlet of his order, each line clean, his beard neatly trimmed. "I assume you've heard," Saldor said, closing the door behind him and ignoring any greeting. Gage was not the type to bother with pleasantries, something Saldor appreciated about the man. Over the past several months, he had seen little of Gage, whom the Patriarch kept occupied searching for the real heir of Novron and the wizard, Ezra Harden. This was also to his liking, as Gage, who was one of only 2 men in the world with direct access to the Patriarch, could be a formidable rival. Strangely, Gage appeared to have little interest in carving out a place for himself in the new empire. Something else to be grateful for. About the nationalists, of course, Gage responded, turning away from the window. And what? And I would like to know what? Saldor halted when he noticed another man in the room. The office was comfortable in size, large enough to accommodate a desk, bookshelves, and a table with a chessboard between 2 soft chairs where the stranger sat. "Oh, yes." Gage motioned to the man. "This is Merrick Marius. Merrick, meet Bishop. Forgive me, Regent Saldor." "Man. So this is him," Saldor muttered, annoyed that the man did not rise. He remained sitting comfortably, leaning back with casual indifference, staring in a manner too direct, too brazen. Merrick wore a thigh-length coat of dark red suede, an awful shade, Saldor thought, the color of dried blood. His hair was short, his face pale, and aside from his coat, his attire was simple and unadorned. "Not very impressive, are you?" Saldor observed. The man smiled at this. "Do you play chess, Your Grace?" Saldor's eyebrows rose and he glanced at Guy. This was his man after all. Guy had been the one who dug him up, unearthing him from the fetid streets, and praised his talents. The sentinel said nothing and showed no outward sign of outrage or discontent with his pet. "I'm running an empire, young man," Saldor replied dismissively. "I don't have time for games." "How strange," Merrick said. "I've never thought of chess as a game. To me, it's really more of a religion. Every aspect of life distilled into 16 pieces, with 64 black and white squares, which, from a distance, actually appear gray. Of course, there are more than a mere 64 squares. The smaller squares, taken in even numbers, form larger ones, creating a total of 204. Most people miss that. They see only the obvious. Few have the intelligence to look deeper, to see the patterns hidden within patterns. That's part of the beauty of chess. It's much more than it first appears. More complicated, more complex. The world at your fingertips, so manageable, so defined. It is such simple rules, a near infinite number of possible paths, but only 3 outcomes. I've heard some clergy-based sermons on the game, explaining the hierarchy of pieces and how they represent the classes of society. They correlate the rules of movement to the duties that each man performs in his service to Maribor. Have you ever done that, Your Grace? Merrick asked. But he did not wait for an answer. Amazing idea, isn't it? He leaned over the board, his eyes searching the field of black and white. The bishop is an interesting piece. He plucked one off the board and held it in his hand, rolling the polished stone figure back and forth across his open palm. It's not a very well-designed piece, not as pretty, perhaps, as, say, the knight. It's often overlooked, hiding in the corners, appearing so innocent, so disarming. But it's able to sweep the length of the board at sharp, unexpected angles, often with devastating results. I've always thought that bishops were underutilized through a lack of appreciation for their talents. I suppose I'm unusual in this respect. But then I'm not the type of person to judge the value of a piece based on how it looks. "You think you're a very clever fellow, don't you?" Saldor challenged. "No, Your Grace," Merrick replied. "Clever is the man who makes a fortune selling dried-up cows, explaining how it saves the farmers the trouble of getting up every morning to milk them. I'm not clever. I'm a genius." At this, Guy interjected. "Regent, at our last meeting I mentioned a solution to the nationalist problem. He sits before you. Mr. Marius has everything worked out. He merely needs approval from the regents." "And certain assurances of payment," Merrick added. "You can't be serious." Saldor whirled on Guy. "The nationalists are sweeping north on a rampage. They've taken Kilnar. They're only miles from Rattabori. They'll be marching on this palace by wintertime. What I need are ideas, alternatives, solutions, not some irreverent popinjay." "You have some interesting ideas, Your Grace," Merrick told Saldor, his voice calm and casual, as if he hadn't heard a word. "I like your views on a central government, the benefits of standardizations in trade, laws, farming, even the widths of roads are excellent. It shows clarity of thought that I wouldn't expect from an elderly church bishop. How do you know anything of my... Merrick raised his hand to halt the regent. I should explain right away that how I obtain information is confidential and not open for discussion. The fact is, I know it. What's more, I like it. I can see the potential in this new empire you're struggling to erect. It may well be exactly what the world needs to get beyond the petty warfare that weakens our nations and mires the common man in hopeless poverty. At present, however, this is still a dream. That is where I come in. I only wish you came to me earlier. I could have saved you that embarrassing and now burdensome problem of Her Eminence. So, that was the result of an unfortunate error on the part of my predecessor, the Archbishop, something he paid for with his life. I was the one who salvaged the situation. Yes, I know. Some idiot named Rufus was supposed to slay the mythical beast, and thereby prove he was the fabled heir of Novron, the descendant of the god Meribor himself. Only instead, Rufus was devoured, and the beast laid waste to everything in the vicinity, everything except a young girl who somehow managed to slay it, and in front of a church deacon, no less. Oops. But you're right. That wasn't your fault. You were the smart one with the brilliant idea to use her as a puppet, a girl so bereft from losing everything and everyone that she went mad. Your solution is to hide her in the depths of the palace and hope no one notices. In the meantime, you and Ethelred run a military campaign to take over all of Avrin, sending your best troops north to invade Melangar, just as the nationalists invade from the south. Brilliant. I must say, with things so well in hand, it's a wonder I was contacted at all. I am not amused, Soldor told him, nor should you be, for at this moment, King Ulrich of Melangar is setting into motion plans to form an alliance with the nationalists, trapping you in a two-front war and bringing Trent into the conflict on their side. You know this. It is what I do. And with the wealth of Dolgos and the might of Trent, your fledgling empire, with its insane Bebzesta Embres, will crumble as quickly as it rose. More impressed now? Guy asked. And what would you have us do to stave off this impending cataclysm? Merrick smiled. Pay me. The grand, exalted Empress Modena Novronian, ruler of Avron and high priestess of the Church of Nephron, sat sprawled on the floor feeding her bowl of soup to Red, who expressed his gratitude by drooling on her dress. He rested his head on her lap and slapped his tail against the stone, his tongue sliding lazily in and out. The Empress curled up beside the dog and laid her head on the animal's side. Amelia smiled. She was encouraged by seeing Modena interact with something, anything. Get that disgusting animal out of here and get her off the floor. Amelia jumped and looked up, horrified. Regent Soldor entered the kitchen with Edith Mon, wearing a sinister smile. Amelia couldn't move. Several scullery maids rushed to the Empress's side and gently pulled her to her feet. The very idea! He continued to shout as the maids busied themselves with smoothing out Modena's dress. You, the regent growled, pointing at Amelia. This is your doing. I should have known. What was I expecting when I put a common street urchin in charge of... He trailed off, looking at Modena with an exasperated expression. At least your predecessors didn't have her groveling with animals. Your Grace, Amelia was... Ibis thinly began. Shut up, you oaf. Soldor snapped at the stocky cook and then returned his attention to Amelia. Your service to the Empress has ended, as well as your employment at this palace. Soldor motioned to the Empress's guard, and then said, Take her out of my sight. The guard approached Amelia, unable to meet her eyes. Amelia breathed in short, stifled gasps and realized she was trembling as the soldier approached. Not normally given to crying, Amelia couldn't help it, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "No?" Modena said, spoken with no force, barely above a whisper. The single word cast a spell on the room. One of the cooking staff dropped a metal pot, which rang loudly on the stone floor. They all stared. The regent turned in surprise and then began to circle the Empress, studying her with interest. The girl had a focused, challenging look as she glared at Soldor. The regent glanced from Amelia to Modena several times. He cocked his head from side to side, as if trying to work out a puzzle. The guard stood by awkwardly. At length, Soldor put him at ease. "As the Empress commands," Soldor said without taking his eyes off Modena. "It seems that I may have been a bit premature in my assessment of—" Soldor glanced at Amelia, annoyed. "What's your name?" Amelia." He nodded as if approving the correct answer. "Your techniques are unusual, but certainly one can't argue with results." Soldor looked back at Modena as she stood within the circle of maids who parted at his approach. "She does look better, doesn't she? Colors improved. There's," he motioned toward her face, "a fullness to her cheeks." He was nodding. He crossed his arms and with a final nod of approval said, "Very well. You can keep the position as it seems to please Her Eminence." The regent turned and headed out of the scullery. He paused at the doorway to look over his shoulder, saying, "You know, I was really starting to believe she was mute." Chapter 7. The Duel. Arista had always thought of herself as an experienced equestrian. Most ladies had never even sat in a saddle, but she had ridden since childhood. The nobles mocked and her father scolded, but nothing could dissuade her. She loved the freedom of the wind in her hair and her heart pounding with the beat of the hooves. Before setting out, she had looked forward to impressing the thieves with her vast knowledge of horsemanship. She knew they would be awed by her skill. She was wrong. In Sheridan, Royce had found her a spirited bay mare to replace her exquisite palfrey. Since setting out, he had forced them over rough ground, fording streams, jumping logs, and dodging low branches, often at a trot. Clutching white-knuckled to the saddle, she had used all her skills and strength just to remain on the horse's back. Gone were her illusions of being praised as a skilled rider, and all that remained was the hope of making it through the day without the humiliation, not to mention the physical pain of falling. They rode south after leaving the university, following trails only Royce could find. Before dawn, they crossed the narrow headwaters of the Gailwar and proceeded up the embankment on the far side. Briars and thickets lashed at them. Unseen dips caught the horses by surprise, and Arista cried out once when her mount made an unexpected lunge across a washed-out gap. Their silence added to her humiliation. If she had been a man, they would have commented. They climbed steadily, reaching such a steep angle that their mounts panted for air in loud snorts, and, on occasion, uttered deep grunts as they struggled to scramble up the dewy slope. At last, they crested the hill, and Arista found herself greeting a chilly dawn atop the windswept Senon uplands. The Senyon was a high, barren plateau of exposed rock and shrub bushes with expansive views on all sides. The horses' hooves clacked loudly on the bare-faced granite until Royce brought them to a stop. His cloak fluttered with the morning breeze. To the east, the sunrise peered at them over the mist-covered forests of Dunmore. From this height, the vast wood looked like a hazy blue lake as it fell away below them, racing toward the dazzling sun. Arista knew that beyond it lay the Nidwalden River, the Partholorian Falls, and the Tower of Avempatha. Royce stared east for several minutes, and she wondered if his elven eyes could see that tiny pinnacle of his people in the distance. In front of them and to the southwest lay the Warwick province of Chadwick. Like everything else west of the ridge, it remained submerged in darkness. Down in the deep, rolling valley, the pre-dawn sky would only now be separating from the dark horizon. It would have appeared peaceful, a world tucked in bed before the first cocks crow, except for the hundreds of lights flickering like tiny fireflies. "Brechton's camp," Hadrian said. "The Northern Imperial Army is not making very good time, it seems. They'll descend before Amber Heights and rejoin the road well past Brechton," Royce explained. "How long do you figure before they reach Colnora?" Hadrian rubbed the growing stubble of his beard. "Another 3, maybe 4 days. An army that size moves at a snail's pace. And I'm guessing Brechton isn't pleased with his orders. He's likely dragging his feet, hoping they'll be rescinded." "You sound as if you know him," Arista said. "I never met the man, but I fought under his father's banner. I've also fought against him when I served in the ranks of King Armund's army in Olberon." "How many armies have you served in?" Hadrian shrugged. "Too many." They pushed on, traversing the crest into the face of a fierce wind, which tugged at her clothes and caused her eyes to water. Arista kept her head down and watched her horse's hooves pick a path across the cracked slabs of lichen-covered rock. She clutched her cloak tight about her neck as the damp of the previous day's rain and sweat conspired with the wind to make her shiver. When they plunged back into the trees, the slow descent began. Once more, the animals struggled. This time, Arista bent backward, nearly to her horse's flanks to keep her balance. Although it was mercifully cooler than the day before, the pace was faster and more challenging. Finally, several hours after midday, they stopped on the bank of a small stream, where the horses gorged themselves on cool water and river grass. Royce and Hadrian grabbed packs and gathered wood. Exhausted, Arista as much fell as sat down. Her legs and backside ached. There were insects and twigs in her hair and a dusting of dirt covering her gown. Her eyes stared at nothing, losing their focus as her mind stalled, numb from fatigue. What have I gotten myself into? Am I up to this? They were below the Gelwar, in Imperial territory. She had thrown herself into the fire, perhaps foolishly. Ulrich would be furious when he found her missing, and she could just imagine what Ekton would say. If they caught her, she stopped herself. This isn't helping. She turned her attention to her escorts. As during the hours on horseback, Royce and Hadrian remained quiet. Hadrian unsaddled the horses and gave them a light brushing while Royce set up a small cook fire. Watching the two of them was entertaining. Without a word, they would toss tools back and forth. Hadrian blindly threw a hatchet over his shoulder, and Royce caught it just in time to begin breaking up branches for the fire. Just as Royce finished the fire, Hadrian had a pot of water ready to place on it for Arista, who had lived her life in public among squabbling nobles and chattering castle staff. Such silence was strange. Hadrian chopped carrots and dropped them into the dented, blackened pot on the coals. "Are you ready to eat the best meal you've ever had, Highness?" She wanted to laugh, but didn't have the strength. Instead, she said, "There are 3 chefs and 18 cooks back at Essendon Castle that would take exception to that remark. They spend their whole lives perfecting elaborate dishes. You'd be amazed at the feasts I've attended, filled with everything from exotic spices to ice sculptures. I highly doubt you'll be able to surpass them." Hadrian smirked. "That might be," he replied, struggling to cut chunks of dry, brine-encrusted pork into bite-sized cubes. but I guarantee this meal will put them all to shame. Arista removed the pearl-handled hairbrush from a pouch that hung at her side, and she tried in vain to untangle her hair. Eventually, giving up, she sat and watched Hadrian drop wretched-looking meat into the bubbling pot. Ash and bits of twigs thrown up by the crackling fire landed in the mix. "Master Chef, debris is getting into your pot." Hadrian grinned. "Always happens. Can't help it. Just be careful not to bite down too hard on anything or you might crack a tooth." "Wonderful," she told him, then turned her attention to Royce, who was busy checking the horse's hooves. "We've come a long way today, haven't we? I don't think I've ever traveled so far, so quickly. You keep a cruel pace." "That first part was over rough ground," Royce mentioned. "We'll cover a lot more miles after we eat." "After we eat?" Arista felt her heart sink. "We aren't stopping for the day." Royce glanced up at the sky. "It's hours until nightfall." "They mean for me to get back into the saddle?" She didn't know if she could stand, much less ride. Virtually every muscle in her body was in pain. They could entertain any thoughts they wished, but she wouldn't travel any farther that day. There was no reason to move this fast or over such rough ground. Why Royce was taking such a difficult course, she didn't understand. She watched as Hadrian dished the disgusting soup he had concocted into a tin cup and held it out to her. There was an oily film across the top, through which green meat bobbed, everything seasoned with bits of dirt and tree bark. Most assuredly, it was the worst thing anyone had ever presented her to eat. Arista held the hot cup between her hands, grimacing and wishing she had eaten more of the meat pie back at Sheridan. "Is this a stew?" she asked. Royce laughed quietly. He likes to call it that. "It's a dish I learned from Thrace," Hadrian explained with a reminiscent look on his face. "She's a much better cook than I am. She did this thing with the meat that..." "Well, anyway, no, it's not stew. It's really just boiled salt pork and vegetables. You don't get the broth, but it takes away the rancid taste of the salt and softens the meat. And it's hot. Trust me, you're gonna love it." Arista closed her eyes and lifted the cup to her lips. The steamy smell was wonderful. Before she realized it, she had devoured the entire thing, eating so quickly she burned her tongue. A moment later, she was scraping the bottom with a bit of hard bread. She looked for more and was disappointed to see Hadrian already cleaning the pot. Lying in the grass, she let out a sigh as the warmth of the meal coursed through her body. "So much for ice sculptures," Hadrian chuckled. Despite her early reluctance, she found new strength after eating. The next leg of the trip was over level ground, along the relative ease of a deer trail. Royce drove them as fast as the terrain allowed, never pausing or consulting a map. After many hours, Arista had no idea where they were, nor did she care. The food faded into memory and she found herself once more near collapse. She rode bent over, resting on the horse's neck and drifting in and out of sleep. She couldn't discern between dream and reality, and would wake in a panic, certain she was falling. Finally, they stopped. Everything was dark and cold. The ground was wet, and she stood shivering once more. Her guides went back into their silent actions. This time, to Arista's immense disappointment, no fire was made, and instead of a hot meal, they handed her strips of smoked meat, raw carrots, an onion quarter, and a triangle of hard, dry bread. She sat on the wet grass, feeling the moisture soak into her skirt and dampen her legs as she devoured the meal without a thought. "Shouldn't we get a shelter up?" she asked hopefully. Royce looked up at the stars. "It looks clear." But she was shocked when he spread out a cloth on the grass. They mean to sleep right here on the ground without even a tent. Arista had 3 handmaids who dressed and undressed her daily. They bathed her and brushed her hair. Servants fluffed pillows and brought warm milk at bedtime. They tended the fireplace in shifts, quietly adding logs throughout the night. Sleeping in her carriage had been a hardship. Sleeping on that ghastly cot in the dorm, a torment. This was insane. Even peasants had hovels. She wrapped her cloak tight against the night's chill. Will I even get a blanket? Tired beyond memory, she got on her hands and knees and feebly brushed a small pile of dead leaves together to act as a mattress. Lying down, she felt them crunch and crinkle beneath her. "Hold on," Hadrian said, carrying over a bundle. He unrolled a canvas tarp. "I really need to make more of these. The pitch will keep the damp from soaking through." He handed her a blanket as well. "Oh, there's a nice little clearing just above those trees, just in case you need it." "Why in the world would I need a—" "Oh," she said, and managed a nod. Surely they would come upon a town soon. She could wait. "Good night, Highness." She didn't reply as Hadrian went a few paces away and assembled his own bed from pine boughs. Without a tent, there was no choice but to sleep in her dress, which left her trapped in a tight corset. Arista spread out the tarp, removed her shoes, and lay down while pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. Though utterly miserable, she stubbornly refused to show it. After all, common women lived every day under similar conditions, so she could as well. The argument was noble, but gave little comfort. The instant she closed her eyes, she heard the faint buzzing. She was blinded by darkness, but the sound was unmistakable. A horde of mosquitoes descended. Feeling one on her cheek, she slapped at it and pulled the blanket over her head, exposing her feet. Curling into a ball, she buried herself under the thin wool shield. Her tight corset made breathing a challenge, and the musty smell of the blanket, long steeped in horse sweat, nauseated her. Arista's frustration overflowed, and tears slipped from her tightly squeezed eyes. What was I thinking coming out here? I can't do this. Oh dear Miribor, what a fool I am. I always think I can do anything. I thought I could ride a horse. What a joke. I thought I was brave. Look at me. I think I know better than anyone I'm an idiot. What a disappointment she was to those who loved her. She should have listened to her father and served the kingdom by marrying a powerful prince. Now that she was tarnished with the stain of witchery, no one would have her. Ulrich had stuck his neck out and given her a chance to be an ambassador. Her failure had doomed the kingdom. Now this trip, this horrible trip, was just one more mistake, one more colossal error. I'll go home tomorrow. I'll ask Royce to take me back to Medford, and I'll formally resign as ambassador. I'll stay in my tower and rot until the Empire takes me to the gallows. But her tears ran down her cheeks as she lay smothered by more than just the blanket until, mercifully, in the cold, unforgiving night, she fell asleep. The songs of birds woke her. Arista opened her eyes to sunlight cascading through the green canopy of leafy trees. Butterflies danced in the brilliant shafts of golden light. The beams revealed a tranquil pond, so placid it appeared as if a patch of sky had fallen. A delicate white mist hovered over the pool's mirrored surface like a scene from a fairy story. Circled by sun-dappled trees, cattails, and flowers, the pool were perfect. The most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Where'd that come from? Royce and Hadrian still slept under rumpled blankets, leaving her alone with the vision. She got up quietly, fearful of shattering the fragile beauty. Walking barefoot to the water's edge, she caught the warmth of the sun, melting the night's chill. She stretched, feeling the unexpected pride in the ache of a well-worked muscle. Crouching, Arista scooped a handful of water and gently rinsed away the stiff tears of the night before. In the middle of the pond, a fish jumped. She saw it only briefly, as it flashed silver, then disappeared with a plop. Another followed, and delighted by the display, Arista stared in anticipation for the next leap, grinning like a child at a puppet show. The mist burned away before sounds from the camp caught her attention, and Arista walked over to find the clearing Hadrian had mentioned. She returned to camp, brushed at her hair, and ate the cold pork breakfast waiting for her. When finished, she folded the blankets and rolled up the tarps, then stowed the food and refilled the water pouches. Arista mounted her mare, deciding at that moment to name her Mystic. Only after Royce had led them out of the little glade did she realize that no one had spoken a single word all morning. They reached the road almost immediately, which explained the lack of a fire the night before, and the unusual way Royce and Hadrian were dressed, in doublets and hose. Hadrian's swords were also conspicuously missing, stowed somewhere out of sight. How Royce had known the road was nearby baffled her. As they traveled with the warm sun overhead and the birds singing in the trees, Arista could scarcely understand what had troubled her the night before. She was still sore, but felt a satisfaction in the dull pain that owed nothing to being a princess. They hadn't gone far when Royce brought Mouse to a stop. A troop of Imperial soldiers came down the road escorting a line of 4 large grain wagons, tall solid-side boxes with flat bottoms. Riders immediately rode forward, bringing a cloud of dust in their wake. An intimidating officer in bright armor failed to give his name, but demanded theirs, as well as their destination and reason for traveling. Soldiers of his vanguard swept around behind the 3 with spears at the ready, horses puffing and snorting. "This is Mr. Everton, of Wyndham Village, and his wife, and I am his servant," Royce explained quickly as he politely dismounted and bowed. His tone and inflections were formal and excessive, his voice nasal and high-pitched. Arista was amazed by how much like her fussy day steward he sounded. Mr. Everton is, a respected merchant. We are on our way to Colnora, where Miss Everton has a brother whom they hope will provide temporary, they will be visiting. Before they had left the Rose and Thorn, Royce had coached Arista on this story, and the part she might have to play. In the safety of the Medford Tavern, it had seemed like a plausible tale. But now that the moment had come, and soldiers surrounded her, she doubted its chances of success. Her palms began to sweat, and her stomach churned. Royce continued to play his part masterfully, supplying answers in his non-threatening, effeminate voice. The responses were specific-sounding, but vague on crucial details. "It's your brother in Colnora?" The officer confronted Arista, his tenor harsh. No one had ever spoken to her in such a tone. Even when Braga had threatened her life, he had been more polite than this. She struggled to conceal her emotion. "Yes," she said simply. Arista was remembering Royce's instructions to keep her answers as short as possible, and her face blank. She was certain the soldiers could hear the pounding of her heart. "His name?" "Vincent Stapleton," she answered quickly and confidently, knowing the officer would be looking for hesitation. "Where does he live?" "Bridge Street, not far from the Hill District," she replied. This was a carefully rehearsed line. It would be typical for the wife of a prominent merchant to boast about how near the affluent section of the city her family lived. Hadrian now played his part. "Look here, I've had quite enough of you and your Imperial army. The truth of the matter is, my estate has been overrun, used to quarter a bunch of brigands like you, who I'm sure will destroy my furniture and soil the carpets. I have some questions of my own, like when will I get my home back? He bellowed angrily. Is this the kind of thing a merchant can expect from the Empress? King Ethelred never treated us like this. Who's going to pay for damages? To Arista's great relief, the officer changed his demeanor. Just as they had hoped, he avoided getting involved in complaints from evicted patrons and waved them on their way. As the wagons passed, she was revolted by the sight visible through the bars on the rear gates. The wagons didn't hold captured soldiers, but elves. Covered in filth, they were packed so tightly they were forced to stand, jostling into each other as the wagon dipped and bounced over the rutted road. There were females and children alongside the males, all slick with sweat from the heat. Arista heard muffled cries as the wagons crawled by at a turtle's pace. Some reached through the bars, pleading for water and mercy. Arista was so sickened at the sight, she forgot her fear, which only a moment before had consumed her. Then a sudden realization struck her. She looked for Royce. He stood a few feet away on the roadside, holding Mouse's bridle. Hadrian was at his side, firmly gripping Royce's arm and whispering in his ear. Arista couldn't hear what he said, but guessed at the conversation. A few tense moments passed, but then they turned and continued toward Colnora. The street below drifted into shadow as night settled in. Carriages raced to their destinations, noisily bouncing along the cobblestone. Lamplighters made their rounds in zigzag patterns, moving from lamp to lamp. Lights flickered to life in windows of nearby buildings, and silhouettes passed like ghosts behind curtains. Shopkeepers closed their doors and shutters, while cart vendors covered their wares and harnessed horses as another day's work ended. "How long do you think?" Hadrian asked. He and Royce had donned their usual garb, and Hadrian once more wore his swords. While Arista was used to seeing them this way, their change in appearance and Royce's constant vigilance at the window put her on edge. "Soon," Royce replied, not altering his concentration on the street. They waited together in the small room at the Regal Fox Inn, the least expensive of the 5 hotels in the affluent Hill district. Once they had arrived, Royce had continued to pose as their servant by renting 2 rooms, one standard, the other small. He avoided inquiries about luggage and arrangements for dinner. The innkeeper had not pursued the matter. When they were upstairs, Royce insisted they all remain in the standard room together. Arista noticed a pause after he said this, as if he expected an argument. This amused her because the idea of sharing a comfortable room was infinitely better than any accommodation she had experienced so far. Still, she had to admit, if only to herself, that a week ago she would have been appalled by the notion. Even the standard room was luxurious by most boarding house standards. The beds were made of packed feathers and covered in smooth, clean sheets, overstuffed pillows and heavy quilts. There were a full-length mirror, a large dresser, a wardrobe, a small writing table and chair, and an adjoining room for the wash basin and chamber pot. The room was equipped with a fireplace and lamps, but Royce left them unlit and darkness filled the space. The only illumination was from the outside street lamps, which cast an oblong checkerboard image on the floor. Now that they were off the road and in a more familiar setting, the princess gave in to curiosity. "I don't understand. What are we doing here?" "Waiting," Royce replied. "For what?" "We can't just ride into the nationalist camp. We need a go-between, someone to set up a meeting," Hadrian said. He sat at the writing desk across the room from her. In the growing darkness, he was fading into a dim, ghostly outline. "I didn't see you send any messages. Did I miss something?" "No, but the messages were delivered nonetheless," Royce mentioned. Royce is a kind of celebrity here, Hadrian told her. When he comes to town, Royce coughed intentionally. Okay, maybe not a celebrity, but he's certainly well known. I'm sure talk started the moment he arrived. Then we wanted to be seen? Yes, Royce replied. Unfortunately, the diamond wasn't the only one watching the gate. Someone's watching our window. And he's not Black Diamond? Hadrian asked. Too clumsy. Has about the same talent for delicate work as a draft horse. The diamond would laugh if he applied. Black Diamond is the Thieves' Guild, she asked. They both nodded. While supposedly a secret organization, the diamond was nevertheless well known. Arista heard of it from time to time in court and at council meetings. They were always spoken about with disdain by haughty nobles, even though they often used their services. The black market was virtually controlled by the diamond, who supplied practically any commodity for anyone willing to pay the price. Can he see you? Not unless he's an elf. Hadrian and Arista exchanged glances, wondering if he had meant it as a joke. Hadrian joined Royce at the window and looked out. The one near the lamppost with his hand on his hilt, the guy shifting his weight back and forth. He's an Imperial soldier, a veteran of the Vanguard Scout Brigade, Hadrian said. Royce looked at him, surprised. The light from the street spilled across Hadrian's face as he grinned. The way he's shifting his weight is a technique taught to soldiers to keep from going footsore. That short sword is standard issue for a lightly armed scout, and the gauntlet on his sword hand is an idiosyncrasy of King Ethelred, who insists all his troops wear them. Since Ethelred is now part of the new empire, the fellow below is an imp. You weren't kidding about serving in a lot of armies, were you? Arista asked. Hadrian shrugged. I was a mercenary. It's what I did. I served anywhere the pay was good. Hadrian took a seat back at the table. I even commanded a few regiments. Got a medal once, but I would fight for one army, only to find myself going against them a few years later. Killing old friends isn't fun, so I kept taking jobs farther away. Ended up deep in Calais fighting for Tenkin warlords. Hadrian shook his head. Guess you could say that was my low point. You really know you've... Hadrian was interrupted by a knock. Without a word, Royce crossed the room, taking up position on one side of the door while Hadrian carefully opened it. Outside, a young boy stood dressed in the typical poor clothing of a waif. Evening, sirs. Your presence is requested in room 23, he said cheerily, and then, tutting his thumb to his brow, he walked away. Leave her here? Hadrian asked Royce. Royce shook his head. She comes along. Must you speak about me as if I'm not in the room? Arista asked, but only with feigned irritation. She sensed the seriousness of the situation from the look on Royce's face and wasn't about to interfere. She was behind enemy lines. If she was caught, it wasn't certain what would happen. If she tried to claim a diplomatic status, it was doubtful the new empire would honor it. Ransoming Arista for Ulrich's compliance was not out of the question, nor was a public execution. We're just going to walk in? Hadrian asked skeptically. Yes, we need their help, and when one goes begging, it's best to knock on the front door. They lodged in room 19, so it was a short trip down the hall and around a corner to room 23. It was conveniently isolated. There were no other doors off this hall, only a stair, which likely led to the street. Royce rapped twice, paused, then added 3 more. The door opened. Come in, Duster. The room was a larger, more luxurious suite with a chandelier brightly lighting the interior. No beds were visible as they entered a parlor. Against the far wall were 2 doors, which no doubt led to sleeping quarters. Dark green damask fabric adorned the walls, and carpet covered the entire floor, except for the area around the marble fireplace. 4 tall windows, each shrouded with thick velvet curtains, decorated the outside wall. Several ornate pieces of furniture lined the room. In the center stood a gaunt man with sunken cheeks and accusing eyes. 2 more men stood slightly behind him, while another 2 waited near the door. "Everyone, please take a seat," the thin man told them. He remained standing until they all had sat. "Duster, let me get right to the point. I made it clear on your last visit that you are not welcome here, didn't I?" Royce was silent. "I was unusually patient then, but seeing as how you've returned, perhaps politeness is not the proper tact to take with you. Personally, I hold you in the highest regard, but as first officer, I simply cannot allow you to blatantly walk into this city after having been warned." He paused, but when no reaction came from Royce, he continued. "Hadrian and the princess are welcome to leave. Point of fact, I must insist the lady leave, as the death of a noblewoman would make things awkward. Shall I assume Hadrian will refuse?" Hadrian glanced at Royce, who did not return his look, and then Hadrian shrugged. "I would hate to miss whatever show is about to start." "In that case, Your Highness," the man made a sweeping hand motion toward the door. "If you'd please return to your room." "I'm staying," Arista said. It was only 2 words, but spoken with all the confidence of a princess accustomed to getting her way. He narrowed his eyes at her. "Shall I escort her, sir?" One of the men near the door offered with a menacing tone. "Touch her, and this meeting will end badly," Royce said, barely above a whisper. "Meeting?" The thin man laughed. "This is no meeting. This is retribution, and it'll most assuredly end very badly." He looked back at Arista. "I've heard about you. I'm pleased to see the rumors are true." Arista had no idea what he meant, but did not like a thug knowing about her. She was even more disturbed by his approval. "Nevertheless, my men will escort you." He clapped his hands, and the 2 doors to the adjoining rooms opened, as did the one behind them leading to the hallway. Many well-armed men poured in. "We're here to see the jewel," Royce quietly said. Immediately, the thin man's expression changed. Arista watched as, in an instant, his face followed a path from confidence to confusion, then suspicion, and finally, curiosity. He ran a bony hand through his thin, blonde hair. "What makes you think the jewel will see you?" "Because there's profit in it for him. The jewel is already very wealthy." "It's not that kind of profit. Tell me, Price, how long have you had the new gate guards, the ones in the Imperial uniforms? For that matter, when did Kolnora get a gate? How many others like them are roaming the city?" Royce sat back and folded his hands across his lap. "I should have been stopped the moment I entered Kolnora, and under Farmer Oslo's field over 2 hours ago. Why the delay? Why are there no watchers posted on the Arch or Burnham Bridge? Are you really getting that sloppy, Price? Or are the imps running the show?" Now it was the thin man's turn to remain silent. The diamond can't be happy with the new empire flexing its muscle. You used to have full reign, and the jewel his own fiefdom. But not anymore? Now he must share. The diamond has been forced back into the shadows, while the new landlord kicks up his heels in front of the fire in the house they built. Tell Cosmos I'm here to help with his little problem." Price stared at Royce, and then his eyes drifted to Arista. He nodded and stood up. "You will, of course, remain here until I return." "Why not?" Hadrian remarked. apparently undisturbed by the tension radiating in the room. "This is a whole lot better than our room. Are those walnuts over there?" During the exchange, and while Price was gone, Royce never moved. 4 men, who were the most menacing of those present, watched him intently. There seemed to be a contest of wills going on, each waiting to see who would flinch first. Hadrian, in contrast, casually strode around the room examining the various paintings and furnishings. He selected a chair with a padded footstool, put up his feet, and began eating from a bowl of fruits and nuts. "This stuff is great," he said. "We didn't get anything like this in our room. Anyone else want some?" They ignored him. "Suit yourself." He popped another handful of walnuts into his mouth. Finally, Price returned. He'd been gone for quite a while, or perhaps it had just seemed that way to Arista as she'd quietly waited. The Jewel had consented to the meeting. A carriage waited for them in front of the Regal Fox. Arista was surprised when Royce and Hadrian surrendered their weapons before boarding. Price joined them in the carriage, while 2 of the guild members sat up top with the driver. They rolled south 2 blocks, then turned west and traveled farther up the hill, past the Tradesman's Arch toward the Langdon Bridge. Through the open window, Arista could hear the metal rims of the coach, and the horses' hooves clattering on the cobblestone. Across from her, the glare of the tavern lights crawled across the face of Price, who sat eyeing her with a malevolent smile. The man was all limbs, with fingers that were too long and eyes sunk too deep. "It would seem you're doing better these days, Duster," he said with his hands folded awkwardly in his lap. "A jackal pretending to be civilized. At least your clientele has improved." The Diamond's first officer smiled a toothy grin and nodded at Arista. "Although rumor has it that Melangar might not be the best investment these days. No offense intended, Your Highness. The Diamond is as a whole, and I personally am, rooting for you, but as a businessman, one does have to face facts." Arista presented him a pleasant smile. "The sun will rise tomorrow, Mr. Price. That is a fact. You have horrid breath and smell of horse manure. That is also a fact. Who will win this war, however, is still a matter of opinion, and I put no weight in yours." Price raised his eyebrows. "She's an ambassador and a woman," Hadrian told him. "You'd be cut less fencing with a Pickering and stand a better chance of winning." Price smiled and nodded. Arista was unsure whether it was in approval or resentment. Such was the face of thieves. "Who exactly are we going to see? Or is that a secret?" "Cosmos Sebastian de Lure, the wealthiest merchant in Avran," Royce replied. "Son of Cornelius de Lure of Delgos, who's probably the richest man alive. Between the 2 of them, the Delora family controls most of the commerce and lends money to kings and commoners alike. He runs the Black Diamond and goes by the moniker of the Jewel." Price's hands twitched slightly. As they reached the summit of the hill, the carriage turned into a long private brick road that ascended Burnham Heights, a sharply rising bluff that overlooked the river below. Protecting the palatial Delora estate was a massive gate, wider than 3 city streets, which opened at their approach. Elegantly dressed guards stood rigid, while a stuffy administrative clerk, with white gloves and a powdered wig, marked their passing on a parchment. Then the carriage began its long serpentine ascent along a hedge and lantern-lined lane. Unexpected breaks in the foliage revealed glimpses of an elegant garden with elaborate sculpted fountains. At the top of the bluff stood a magnificent white marble mansion. 3 stories in height, it was adorned with an 18-pillar colonnade, forming a half-moon entrance illuminated by a massive chandelier suspended at its center. This estate was built to impress, But what caught Arista's attention was the huge bronze fountain of 3 nude women pouring pitchers of water into a pool. A pair of gold doors were opened by 2 more impeccably dressed servants. Another man, dressed in a long dark coat, led the way into the vestibule, filled with tapestries and more sculptures than Arista had ever seen in one place. They were led through an archway outside to an expensive patio. Ivy-covered lattices lined an open-air terrace, decorated with a variety of unusual plants and 2 more fountains, once more of nude women. Only these were much smaller and wrought of polished marble. "Good evening, Your Highness, gentlemen. Welcome to my humble home." Seated on a luxurious couch, a large man greeted them. He wasn't tall, but of amazing girth. He looked to be in his early 50s and well on his way to going bald. He tied what little hair he had left with a black silk ribbon and let it fall in a tail down his back. His chubby face remained youthful, showing signs of age only at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, as he was doing now. He dressed in a silk robe and held a glass of wine, which threatened to spill as he motioned them over. "Duster, how long has it been, my old friend? I can see now that I should have made you first officer when I had the chance. It would have saved so much trouble for the both of us. Alas, but I couldn't see it then. I hope we can put all that unpleasantness behind us now." "My business was settled the day Hoyt died," Royce replied. "Judging from our reception, I would say it was the diamond that was having trouble putting the past behind them." Quite right, Cosmos chuckled. Arista determined he was the kind of man who laughed the way other people twitched, stammered, or bit their nails. "You won't let me get away with anything, will you? That's good. You keep me honest. Well, as honest as a man in my profession can be." He chuckled again. "It's that pesky legend that keeps the guild on edge. You're quite the bogeyman. Not that Mr. Price here buys into any of that, you understand. But it's his responsibility to keep the organization running smoothly. Allowing you to stroll about town is like letting a man-eating tiger meander through a crowded tavern. As the tavern keeper, they expect me to maintain the peace." Cosmos motioned toward Price with his goblet. "You knew Mr. Price only briefly when you were still with us, I think. A pity. You would like him if you met under different circumstances." "Who said I didn't like him?" Cosmos laughed. "You don't like anyone, Duster, with the exception of Hadrian and Ms. Delancey, of course. There are only those you put up with and those you don't. By the mere fact that I'm here, I can at least deduce I'm not on your short list." "Short list? I can't imagine your slate of targets stays full for very long." "We both have lists. Names get added and names get erased all the time. It would appear Price added me to yours. Consider it erased, my friend. Now tell me, what can I get you to drink? Montemorosi? You always had a fondness for the best. I have a vintage stock in the cellar. I'll have a couple of bottles brought up." "That'd be fine," Royce replied. Cosmos gave a slight glance to a steward, who bowed abruptly and left. "I hope you don't mind meeting in my little garden. I do so love the night air." Closing his eyes and tilting his head up, he took a deep breath. "I don't manage to get out nearly as often as I would like. Now please sit and tell me about this offer you bring." "Ben." They took seats opposite Cosmos on elaborate cushioned benches, the span between taken up by an ornate table whose legs were fashioned to look like powerful snakes, each different from the next, facing out with fanged mouths open. Behind them, Arista could hear the gurgling of fountains and the late breeze shifting foliage. Below that was the deeper, menacing roar of the Burnham River, hidden from view by the balcony. "It's more of a proposition, really," Royce replied. "The princess here has a problem you might be able to help with, and you have a problem she may be able to solve." Wonderful, wonderful. I like how this is starting. If you had said you were offering me the chance of a lifetime, I would have been doubtful. But arrangements of mutual benefit show you're being straightforward. I like that. But you were always blunt, weren't you, Duster? You could afford to lay your cards on the table because you always had such excellent cards. A servant with white gloves identical to those worn by the gate clerk arrived and silently poured the wine, then withdrew to a respectful distance. Cosmos waited politely for them each to take a taste. Montemorosi is one of the finest vineyards in existence, and my cellar has some of their very best. Royce nodded his praise. Hadrian sniffed the dark red liquid skeptically, then swallowed the contents in a single mouthful. Not bad for old grape juice. Cosmos laughed once more. Not a wine drinker. I should have known. Wine is no potable for a warrior. Gibbons, bring Hadrian a pull from the oak cask and leave the head on it. That should be more to your liking. Now, Duster, tell me about our mutual problems. Your problem is obvious. You don't like this new empire crowding you. Indeed, I do not. They're everywhere and spreading. For each one you see in uniform, you can expect 3 more you don't. Tavern keepers and blacksmiths are secretly working for the imperialists, passing information. It's impossible to run a proper guild, as extensive and elaborate as the Black Diamond, in such a restrictive environment. There is even evidence they have spies in the diamond itself, which is most unsettling. I also happen to know that Deegan Gaunt is your boy. Well, not mine, per se. Your father's, then. Gaunt is supported by Delgos. Tour del Four is the capital of Delgos, and your father is the ruler of Tour del Four. Cosmos laughed again. No, not the ruler. Delgos is a republic, remember. He's but one of a triumvirate of businessmen elected to lead the government. Uh-huh. You don't sound convinced. It doesn't matter. The Delors are backing Gaunt in the hopes of breaking the Empire, so something that might help Gaunt would help you as well. True, true. And what are you bringing me? An alliance with Melangar. The princess here is empowered to negotiate on behalf of her brother. Word has it Melangar is helpless and about to fall to Ballantyne's northern imperial army. Word is mistaken. The Empress recalled the northern army to deal with the nationalists. We passed it near Fallon Mire. Only a token force remains to watch the Gaelwar River. The army moves slowly, but it'll reach Equestria before Gaunt does. That will tip the scales in favor of the Empire. What are you suggesting? Royce looked at Arista, indicating that she should speak now. Arista set down her glass and gathered her thoughts as best she could. She was still befuddled from the day's ride, and now the wine on an empty stomach caused her head to fog. She took a short breath and focused. Melangar still has a defensive force, the princess began. If we use it to attack across the river and break into Chadwick, there would be nothing to stop us from sweeping across to Gloucester. Once there, Marquis Lanaclin would raise an army from his loyal subjects, and together we could march on Coolnora. We can catch the Empire in a vice with Melangar pushing from the north and the nationalists from the south. The Empire would have to either recommit the northern army, leaving the capital to Gaunt, or let us sweep across northern Warwick unopposed. Cosmos said nothing, but there was a smile on his face. He took a drink of his wine and sat back to consider their words. All we need you to do, Royce spoke again, is to set up a meeting between Gaunt and the princess. Once a formal agreement is struck between the nationalists and Melangar, Arista explained, I can take that to Trent. With the nationalists on Equestria's doorstep and my brother ravaging northern Warwick, Trent will be more than happy to join us. and with their help, the new empire will be swept back into history where it belongs. "You paint a lovely picture, Your Highness," Cosmos said. "But is it possible for Melangar to break out of Medford? Will Lanaclin be able to raise a force quickly enough to fend off any counterattack the Empire sends?" I suspect you would say yes to both, but without the conviction that comes from knowing. Fortunately, these are not my concern, so much as they're yours. I'll contact Gaunt's people and arrange a meeting. It'll take a few days, however, and in the meantime, it's not safe for you to stay in Wulnora. "What do you mean?" Royce asked. "As I said, I fear it's possible the guild has been compromised. Mr. Price tells me Imperial scouts were on hand when you passed through the gate, so it would only be wishful thinking to suppose your visit here was not observed. Given the situation, it'll not take a genius to determine what's happening. The next logical step would be to eliminate the threat. And, Duster, you're not the only Diamond alumnus passing through Warwick. Ye." Royce's eyes narrowed as he stared at Cosmos and studied the fat man carefully. Cosmos said nothing more on the subject, and strangely, Royce did not inquire further. "We leave immediately," Royce said abruptly. "We'll head south into Renyad, which will carry us closer to Gaunt. I'll expect you to contact us with the meeting's place and time in 3 days. If by the morning of the 4th day we don't hear from you, we'll find our own way to Gaunt. If you don't hear from me by then, things will be very bad indeed," Cosmos assured them. "Gibbons, see that they have whatever is needed for travel. Price, arrange for them to slip out of town unnoticed and get that message to Gaunt's people." "Will you need to send a message back to Medford?" Cosmos asked the princess. She hesitated briefly. "Not until I've reached an agreement with Gaunt. Oleg knows the tentative plan and has already begun preparing the invasion." "Excellent," Cosmos said, standing up and draining his glass. "What a pleasure it is to work with professionals. Good luck to all of you, and may fortune smile upon us. Just remember to watch your back, Duster. Some ghosts never die. Your horses and gear will be taken to Finland's windmill by morning," Price told them as he rapidly led them out through the rear patio. His long, gangly legs gave him the appearance of a wayward scarecrow fleeing across a field. Noticing Arista had trouble keeping up, he paused for her to catch her breath. "However, you 3 will be leaving by boat down the Burnham tonight. There'll be a watch on the Langdon and the South Bridge," Royce reminded him. "Armed with crossbows and hot pitch, I imagine," Price replied, grinning. His face looked even more skull-like in the darkness. "But no worries. Arrangements have been made. The Burnham started as a series of tiny creeks that cascaded from Amber Heights and the Xenon uplands. They converged, creating a swift-flowing river that cut through a limestone canyon, forming a deep gorge. Eventually, it spilled over Amber Falls. The drop took the fight out of the water, and from there on, the river flowed calmly through the remaining ravine that divided the city. This put Kolnora at the navigable headwater of the Burnham, the last stop for goods coming up the river, and a gateway for anyone traveling to Dagestan Bay. After Arista had regained her breath, Price resumed rushing them along at a storm's pace. They ducked under a narrow ivy-covered archway and passed through a wooden gate which brought them to the rear of the estate. A short stone wall, only a little above waist-high, guarded the drop to the river gorge. Looking down, she could see only darkness, but across the expanse, she could make out points of light and the silhouette of buildings. Price directed them to an opening and the start of a long wooden staircase. "Our neighbor, Bokent, the pork mogul, has his 6-oxen hoist," Price said, motioning to the next mansion over. Arista could just make out a series of cables and pulleys connected to a large metal box. 2 lanterns, one hung at the top and another at the bottom, revealed the extent of the drop, which appeared to be more than 100 feet. But we have to make do with our more traditional, albeit more dangerous, route. Try not to fall. The steps are steep, and it's a long way down. The stairs were indeed frightening, a plummeting zigzag of planks and weathered beams bolted to the cliff's face. It looked like a diabolical puzzle of wood and rusting metal, which quaked and groaned the moment they stepped on it. Arista was certain she felt its sway. Memories of a tower collapsing while she clutched onto Royce flooded back to her. Taking a deep breath, she gripped the handrail with a sweaty palm and descended, sandwiched between Royce and Hadrian. A narrow dock sat at the bottom, and a shallow draft rowboat banged dully against it with the river's swells. A lantern mounted on the bow illuminated the area with a yellow flicker. "Put that damn light out, you fools!" Price snapped at the 2 men readying the craft. A quick hand snuffed out the lantern, and Arista's eyes adjusted to the moonlight. From previous trips to Kolnora, she knew that the river was as congested as Main Street on Hospitality Road during the day, but in the dark, it lay empty, the vast array of watercraft bobbing at various piers. When the last of the supplies were aboard, Price returned their weapons. Hadrian strapped his on, and Royce's white-bladed dagger disappeared into the folds of his cloak. "In you go," Price told them, putting one foot on the gunwale to steady the boat. A stocky, shirtless boatman stood in the center of the skiff and directed them to their seats. "Which one of you might be handy with a tiller?" he asked. "Etcher," Price said. "Why don't you take the tiller?" "I'm no good with a boat," the wiry youth with a thin mustache and goatee replied as he adjusted the lay of the gear. "I'll take the rudder," Hadrian said. "And grateful I am to you, sir." The boatman greeted him cheerily. "Name's Wally. You shouldn't need to use it much. I can steer fine with just the oars, but in the current it's sometimes best not to paddle at all. All you needs to do is keep her in the center of the river." Hadrian nodded. "I can do that. But of course you can, sir." Royce held Arista's hand as she stepped aboard and found a seat beside Hadrian on a shelf of worn planking. Royce followed her and took up position near the bow next to Etcher. "When did you order the supplies brought down?" Royce asked Price, who still stood with his foot on the rail. "Before returning to pick you up at the Regal Fox. I like to stay ahead of things." He winked. "Duster, you might remember Etcher here from the Langdon Bridge last time you were in Kolnora. Don't hold that against him. Etcher volunteered to get you safely to the mills when no one else cared for the idea. Now, off you go." Price untied the bowline and shoved them out into the black water. "Stow those lines, Mr. Etcher, sir," Wally said, as he waited until they cleared the dock to lock the 2 long oars into place. With each stroke, the oars creaked quietly and the skiff glided into the river's current. The boatman sat backward as he pulled on the oars. Little effort was required as the current propelled them downstream. Wally pulled on one side or the other, correcting their course as needed. Occasionally, he stroked both together to keep them moving slightly faster than the water's flow. "Blast!" Wally cursed softly. "What is it?" Hadrian asked. "The lantern went out on the Bocant dock. I use it to steer by. Just my luck. Any other night they leave it on. They use that hoisting contraption to unload boats. Sometimes the barges are late rounding the point, and in the darkness that lantern is their marker. They never know when the barges will arrive, so they usually just leave it on all night and... Oh wait, it's back. Must have just blown out or something." "Quiet down," Etcher whispered from the bow. This is no pleasure cruise. You're being paid to row, not be a river guide. Royce peered into the dark wake. Is it normal for small boats to be on the river at night? Not unless you're smuggling, Wally said in a coy tone that made Arista wonder if he had first-hand experience. If you don't keep your trap shut, someone will notice us, Etcher growled. Too late, Royce replied. What's that? Behind us. There's at least one boat following. Arista looked, but could see nothing except the line the moon drew on the black surface of the water. You've got a fine pair of eyes, you do, Wally said. You're the one that saw them, Royce replied. The light on the dock didn't go out. The other boat blocked it when they passed in your line of sight. How many? Hadrian asked. 6. And they're in a wherry. They'll be able to catch us, then, won't they? Arista questioned. Hadrian nodded. They race wherries down on the Galewar and here on the Burnham for prize money. No one races skiffs. Despite this, Wally stroked noticeably harder, which combined with the current, moved the skiff along at a brisk pace, raising a breeze in their faces. Langdon Bridge approaching, Etcher announced. Arista saw it towering above them as they rushed toward it. Massive pillars of stone blocks formed the arches supporting the bridge, whose broad span straddled the river 8 stories above. She could barely make out the curved heads of the decorative swan-shaped street lamps that lit the bridge, creating a line of lights against the starry sky. There are men up there, Royce said, and Price wasn't kidding about them having crossbows. Wally glanced over his shoulder and peered up at the bridge before regarding Royce curiously. What are you, pard owl? Stop paddling and shut up, Etcher ordered, and Wally pulled his oars out of the water. They floated silently, propelled by the river's current. In the swan lights, the men on the span soon became visible, even to Arista. A dark boat on a black river would be hard, but not impossible to spot. The skiff started to rotate sideways as the current pushed the stern. A nod from Wally prompted Hadrian to compensate with the tiller, and the boat straightened. Light exploded into the night sky. A bright orange and yellow glow spilled onto the bridge from somewhere on the left bank. A warehouse was on fire. It burst into flame, spewing sparks skyward like a cyclone of fireflies. Silhouetted figures ran the length of the bridge and harsh shouts cut the stillness of the night. Now paddle, Etcher ordered, and Wally put his back into it. Arista used the opportunity to glance aft, and now she also saw the wherry, illuminated by the fire from above. The approaching boat was a good 15 feet in length, and she guessed barely 4 feet across. 4 men sat in 2 side-by-side pairs, each manning an oar. Besides the oarsman, there were a man sitting in the stern and another at the bow with a grappling hook. I think they mean to board us, Arista whispered. No, Royce said. They're waiting. For what? I'm not sure, but I don't intend to find out. Give us as much distance as you can, Wally. Slide over, pal. Let me give you a hand, Hadrian told the boatman as he took up a seat beside him. Arista, take the tiller. The princess replaced Hadrian, grabbing hold of the wooden handle. She had no idea what to do with it and opted for keeping it centered. Hadrian rolled up his sleeves and, bracing his feet against the toggles, took one of the oars. Royce slipped off his cloak and boots and dropped them onto the floor of the boat. Don't do anything stupid, Etcher told him. We've still got another bridge to clear. Just make sure you get them past the South Bridge and we'll be fine, Royce said. Now, gentlemen, if you could put a little distance between us. On 3, Wally announced, and they began stroking together, pulling hard and fast, so that the bow noticeably rose and a wake began to froth. Caught by surprise, Etcher stumbled backward and nearly fell. "What the blazes are?" Etcher started when Royce leapt over the gunwale and disappeared. "Damn fool! What does he expect us to do? Wait for him?" "Don't worry about Royce," Hadrian replied as he and Wally stroked in unison. To Arista, the wherry did seem to drop farther back, but perhaps that was only wishful thinking. "South Bridge," Etcher whispered. As they approached, Arista saw another fire blazing. This time it was a boat dock, burning like well-aged kindling. The old South Bridge, which marked the city's boundary, wasn't nearly as high as the Langdon and Arista could easily see the guards. "They aren't going for it this time," Hadrian said. "They're staying at their posts. Quiet. We might slip by," Etcher whispered. With oars held high, they all sat as still as statues. Arista found herself in command of the skiff as it floated along in the current. She quickly learned how the rudder affected the boat. The results felt backward to her. Pulling right made the bow swing left. Terrified of making a mistake, she concentrated on keeping the boat centered and straight. Up ahead, something odd was being lowered from the bridge. It looked like cobwebs or tree branches dangling. She was going to steer around it when she realized it stretched the entire span. "They draped a net," Etcher said, a little too loudly. Wally and Hadrian back-paddled, but the river's current was the victor and the skiff flowed helplessly into the fishnet. The boat rotated, pinning itself sideways. Water frothed along the length, threatening to tip them. "Shore your boat, and don't move from it." A shout echoed down from above. A lantern, lowered from the bridge, revealed their struggles to free themselves from the mesh. Etcher, Wally, and Hadrian slashed at the netting with knives. But before they could clear it, 2 Imperial soldiers descended and took up position on the bank. Each was armed with a crossbow. "Stop now, or we'll kill you where you stand," the nearest soldier ordered with a harsh, anxious voice. Hadrian nodded, and the 3 dropped their knives. Arista couldn't take her eyes off the crossbows. She knew those weapons. She had seen Essendon soldiers practicing with them in the yard. They pierced old helms placed on dummies, leaving huge holes through the heavy metal. These were close enough for her to see the sharp iron heads of the bolts, the power to pierce armor held in check by a small trigger and pointed directly at them. Wally and Hadrian maneuvered the boat to the bank, and one by one they exited, Hadrian offering Arista his hand as she climbed out. They stood side by side, Arista and Hadrian in front, Wally and Etcher behind. "Remove your weapons," one of the soldiers ordered, motioning toward Hadrian. Hadrian paused, his eyes shifting between the 2 bowmen before slipping off his swords. One of the soldiers approached while the other stayed back, maintaining a clear line of sight. "What are your names?" the foremost soldier asked. No one answered. The lead guard took another step forward and intently studied Arista. "Well, well, well," he said. "Look what we have here, Joss. We done caught ourselves a fine fish, we have." "Who is it?" Joss asked. "This here is that princess of Milan Gar, the one they say is a witch." "How do you know?" "I recognize." "I was in Medford the year she was on trial for killing her father." "What's she doing here, you think?" "Don't know." "What are you doing here?" She said nothing, her eyes locked on the massive bolt heads. Made of heavy iron, the points looked sharp. Night killers, Sir Ecton called them. "What will they do to me?" "The captain will have to find out," the soldier said. "I recognize these 2 as well." He motioned to Wally and Etcher. "I seen them round the city afore." "Course you have," Wally spoke up. I've piloted this river for years. We weren't doing nothing wrong. If you've been on this river afore, then you knows we don't allow transport at night." Wally didn't say anything. "I don't know that one, though. What's your name?" "Hadrian," he said, taking the opportunity to step forward as if to shake hands. "Back, back," the guard shouted, bringing his bow to bear at Hadrian's chest. Hadrian immediately stopped. "Take one more step, and I'll punch a hole clear through you." "So, what's your plan?" Hadrian asked. "You and your pals just sit tight. We sent a runner to fetch a patrol. We'll take you over to see the captain. He'll know what to do with the likes of you." "I hope we don't have to wait long," Hadrian told them. "This damp night air isn't good. You could catch a cold. Looks like you have already. What do you think, Arista?" "I ain't got no cold." "Are you sure? Your eyes and nose look red. Arista, you agree with me, don't you?" "What?" Arista said, still captivated by the crossbows. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest and barely heard Hadrian addressing her. "I bet you two been coughing and sneezing all night, haven't you?" Hadrian continued. "Nothing worse than a summer cold, right, Arista?" Arista was dumbfounded by Hadrian's blathering and his obsession with the health of the two soldiers. She felt obligated to say something. I suppose. "Sneezing, that's the worst. I hate to sneeze." Arista gasped. "Just shut up," the soldier ordered. Without taking his eyes off Hadrian, he called to Jus behind him. "See anyone coming yet?" "Not yet," Jus replied. "All of them off dealing with that fire, I suspect." Arista had never tried this under pressure before. Closing her eyes, she fought to remember the concentration technique Ezra Hardin had taught her. She took deep breaths, cleared her mind, and tried to calm herself. Arista focused on the sounds around her, the river lapping against the boat, the wind blowing through the trees, and the chirping of the frogs and crickets. Then, slowly, she blocked each out, one by one. Opening her eyes, she stared at the soldiers. She saw them in detail now, the 3-day-old whiskers on their faces, their rumpled tabards, even the rusted links in their hauberks. Their eyes showed their nervous excitement, and Arista thought she even caught the musky odor of their bodies. Breathing rhythmically, she focused on their noses as she began to hum, then mutter. Her voice slowly rose as if in song. "I said no." The soldier stopped suddenly, wrinkling his nose. His eyes began to water and he shook his head in irritation. "I said no." He began again and stopped once more, gasping for air. At the same time, Jus was having similar problems, and the louder Arista's voice rose, the greater their struggle. Raising her hand, she moved her fingers as if writing in the air. "I said, I... Arista made a sharp clipping motion with her hand, and both of them abruptly sneezed in unison. In that instant, Hadrian lunged forward and broke the closest guard's leg with a single kick to his knee. He pulled the screaming guard in front of him just as the other fared. The crossbow bolt caught the soldier square in the chest, piercing the metal ringlets of his hauberk and staggering both of them backward. Letting the dead man fall, Hadrian picked up his bow as the other guard turned to flee. Snap! The bow launched the bolt. The impact made a deep, resonating thwack and drove the remaining guard to the ground, where he lay dead. Hadrian dropped the bow. "Let's move." They jumped back in the skiff just as the wherry approached. It came out of the darkness, its long, pointed shape no longer slicing through the water. Instead, it drifted aimlessly, helpless to the whims of the current. As it approached, it became apparent why. The wherry was empty. Even the oars were gone. As the boat passed by, a dark figure crawled out of the water. "Why have you stopped?" Royce admonished, wiping his wet hair away from his face. I would have caught up. Spotting the bodies halted his need for explanation. Hadrian pushed the boat into the river, leaping in at the last instant. From above, they could hear men's voices. They finished cutting loose the net, and once free, slipped clear of the bridge. The current, combined with Wally's and Hadrian's pulling hard on the oars, sent them flying downriver in the dark of night, leaving the city of Kulnora behind them. Chapter 8, Hintindar. Arista woke feeling disoriented and confused. She'd been dreaming about riding in her carriage. She sat across from both Solly and Ezra Harden. Only in her dream, Ezra Harden had hands, and Solly was wearing his bishop's robes. They were trying to pour brandy from a flask into a cup, and were discussing something, a heated argument. But she could not recall it. A bright light hurt her eyes, and her back ached from sleeping on something hard. She blinked, squinted, and looked around. Her memory returned as she realized she was still in the skiff, coasting down the Burnham River. Her left foot was asleep, and dragging it from under a bag started the sensation of pins and needles. The morning sun shone brightly. The limestone cliffs were gone, replaced by sloping farmlands. On either side of the river, lovely green fields swayed gently in the soft breeze. The tall, spiked grass might have been wheat, although it could just as easily have been barley. Here the river was wider and moved slower. There was hardly any current, and Wally was back to rowing. "Morning, my lady," he greeted her. "Morning," Hadrian said from his seat at the tiller. "I guess I dozed off," she replied, pulling herself up and adjusting her gown. "Did anyone else get any sleep?" "I'll sleep when I get downriver," Wally replied, hauling on the oars, rocking back, then sitting up again. The paddle blades dripped and plunged. "After I drop you fine folks off, I'll head down to Evelyn, catch a nap and a meal, then try to pick up some travelers or freight to take back up. No sense in fighting this current for nothing." Arista looked toward Hadrian. "Some," he told her. "Royce and I took turns." Her hair was loose and falling in her face. Her blue satin ribbon had been lost somewhere during the night's ride from Sheridan. Since then, she'd been using a bit of rawhide provided by Hadrian. Even that was missing now, and she poked about her hair and found the rawhide caught in a tangle. While she worked to free it, she said, "You should have woken me. I would have taken a shift at the tiller." "We actually considered it when you started to snore." "I don't snore." "I beg to differ," Hadrian chided while chewing. She looked around the skiff as each of them, even Etcher, nodded. Her face flushed. Hadrian chuckled. "Don't worry about it. You can't be held accountable for what you do in your sleep." "Still," she said, "it's not very ladylike." "Well, if that's all you're worried about, you can forget it," Hadrian informed her with a wicked smirk. "We lost all illusions of you being prissy back in Sheridan." How much better it was when they were silent. "That's a compliment," he added hastily. "You don't have much luck with the ladies, do you, sir?" Wally asked, pausing briefly and letting the paddles hang out like wings, leaving a tiny trail of droplets on the smooth surface of the river. "I mean, with compliments like that and all." Hadrian frowned at him, then turned back to her with a concerned expression. "I really did mean it as a compliment. I've never met a lady who would... Well, without complaining, you've been..." He paused in frustration, then added, "That little trick you managed back there was really great." Arista knew Hadrian only brought up the sneezing spell to try to smooth things over, but she had to admit a sense of pride. that she had finally contributed something of value to their trip. That was the first practical application of hand magic I've ever performed. "I really wasn't sure you could do it," Hadrian said. "Who would have thought such a silly thing would come in handy? Travel with us long enough and you'll see we can find a use for just about anything." Hadrian extended his hand. "Cheese?" he asked. "It's really quite good." Arista took the cheese and offered him a smile, but was disappointed he didn't see it. His eyes had moved to the riverbank, and her smile faded as she ate self-consciously. Wally continued to paddle in even strokes, and the world passed slowly by. They rounded bend after bend, skirting a fallen tree, then a sandy point. It took Arista nearly an hour with her brush to finally work all the knots out of her hair. She retied its length with the rawhide into a respectable ponytail. Eventually, a gap opened in the river reeds to reveal a small sandy bank that showed signs of previous boat landings. "Put in here," Etcher ordered, and Wally deftly spun the boat to land beneath the shadow of a massive willow tree. Etcher leapt out and tied the bowline. "This is our stop. Let's get the gear off." "Not yet," Royce said. "You want to check the mill sails first?" "Oh, yeah." Etcher nodded, looking a little embarrassed and a tad irritated. "Wait here," he said before trotting up the grassy slope. "Sails?" Hadrian asked. "Just over this rise is the millwright Ethan Finland's windmill," Royce explained. "Finland is a member of the Diamond. His windmill is used to store smuggled goods and also serves as a signal that can be seen from the far hills. If the mill's sails are spinning, then all is clear. If furled, then there's trouble. The position of the locked sails indicates different things. If straight up and down like a ship's mast, it means he needs help. If the sails are cockeyed, it means stay away. There are other signals as well, but I'm sure they've changed since I was a member." "All clear?" Etcher notified them as he strode back down the hill. They each took a pack, waved goodbye to Wally, and climbed up the slope. Finland's mill was a tall, weathered tower that sat high on the crest of a grassy knoll. The windmill's cap rotated and currently faced into the wind, which blew steadily from the northeast. Its giant sails of cloth-covered wooden frames rotated slowly, creaking as they turned the great mill's shaft. Around the windmill were several smaller buildings, storage sheds, and wagons. The place was quiet and absent of customers. They found their horses, as well as an extra one for Etcher, along with their gear in a nearby barn. Finland briefly stuck his nose out of the mill and waved. They waved back, and Royce had a short talk with Etcher as Hadrian saddled their animals and loaded the supplies. Arista threw her own saddle on her mare, which garnered a smile from Hadrian. "Saddle your own horse often, do you?" he asked as she reached under the horse's belly for the cinch. The metal ring at the end of the wide band swung back and forth, making catching it a challenge without crawling under the animal. "I'm a princess, not an invalid. Not..." She caught the cinch and looped the leather strap through it, tying what she thought was a fine knot, exactly like the one she used to tie her hair. "Can I make one minor suggestion?" She looked up. "Of course. You need to tie it tighter and use a flat knot." "That's 2 suggestions. Thanks, but I think it'll be fine." He reached up and pulled on the saddle's horn. The saddle easily slid off and came to rest between the horse's legs. But it was tight. "I'm sure it was." "Mim." Hadrian pulled the saddle back up and undid the knot. "People think horses are stupid, dumb animals, they call them. But they're not. This one, for instance, just outsmarted the Princess of Melangar." He pulled the saddle off, folded the blanket over, and returned the saddle to the animal's back. You see, horses don't like to have a saddle bound around their chest any more than I suspect you enjoy being trussed up in a corset. The looser the better, they figure, because they don't really mind if you slide off. He looped the leather strap through the ring in the cinch and pulled it tight. So what she's doing right now is holding her breath, expanding her chest, and waiting for me to tie the saddle on. When she exhales, it'll be loose. Thing is, I know this. I also know she can't hold her breath forever. He waited with 2 hands on the strap, and the moment the mare exhaled, he pulled, gaining a full 4 inches. See? She watched as he looped the strap across, then through and down, making a flat knot that laid comfortably against the horse's side. Okay, I admit it. This is the first time I've saddled a horse, she confessed. And you're doing wonderfully, he mocked. You're aware I can have you imprisoned for life, right? Royce and Etcher entered the barn. The younger thief grabbed his horse and left without a word. Friendly sorts, those diamonds are, Hadrian observed. Cosmos seemed hospitable, Arista pointed out. Yeah, but that's how you might expect a spider to talk to a fly as she wraps him up. What an interesting metaphor, Arista noted. You could have a future in politics, Hadrian. He glanced at Royce. We never considered that as one of the options. I'm not sure how it differs from acting. He never likes my ideas, Hadrian told her, then turned his attention back to Royce. Where to now? Hintendur, Royce replied. Hintendur. Are you serious? It's out of the way and a good place to disappear for a while. Problem. Hadrian narrowed his eyes. You know darn well there's a problem. What's wrong? Arista asked. I was born in Hintendur. I've already told Etcher that's where we'll wait for him, Royce said. Nothing we can do about it now. But Hintendur is just a tiny manorial village, some farms and trade shops. There's no place to stay. Even better, after Kulnora, lodging in a public house might not be too smart. There must be a few people there that still know you. I'm sure someone will lend a hand and put us up for a while. We need to go somewhere off the beaten track. You don't honestly think anyone is still following us? I know the Empire would want to stop Arista from reaching Gaunt, but I doubt anybody recognized her in Kulnora. At least, no one still alive. Royce didn't answer. Royce? I'm just playing it safe, he snapped. Royce, what did Cosmos mean back there about you not being the only ex-diamond in Warwick? What was that talk of ghosts all about? Royce remained silent. Hadrian glared at him. I came along as a favor to you, but if you're going to keep secrets... Royce relented. It's probably nothing, but then again, Merrick could be after us. Hadrian lost his look of irritation and replied with a simple, "Oh." Anyone going to tell me who Merrick is? Arista asked, or why Hadrian doesn't want to go home. I didn't leave under the best of circumstances, Hadrian answered, and haven't been back in a long time. And Merrick? Merrick Marius, also known as Cutter, was Royce's friend once they were members of the Diamond together, but they... He glanced at Royce. Well, let's just say they had a falling out. So, Hadrian waited for Royce to speak, and when he did not, answered for him. It's a long story, but the gist of the matter is that Merrick and Royce seriously don't get along. He paused, then added, Merrick is an awful lot like Royce. Arista continued to stare at Hadrian until the revelation dawned on her. Still, that doesn't mean Merrick is after us, Hadrian went on. It's been a long time, right? Why would he bother with you now? He's working for the Empire, Royce said. That's what Cosmos meant, and if there's an Imperial mole in the Diamond, Merrick knows all about us by now. Even if there isn't a spy, Merrick could still find out about us from the diamond. There are plenty who think of him as a hero for sending me to Manzand. I'm the evil one in their eyes." "You were in Manzand?" Arista asked, stunned. "It's not something he likes to talk about," Hadrian again answered for him. "So if Merrick is after us, what do we do?" "What we always do," Royce replied, "only better." The village of Hintendur lay nestled in a small sheltered river valley surrounded by gentle hills. A patchwork of 6 cultivated fields outlined by hedgerows and majestic stands of oak and ash decorated the landscape in a crop mosaic. Horizontal lines of mounded green marked 3 of the fields with furrows, stone, and strips to hold the runoff. Animals grazed in the 4th field, and the 5th was cut for hay. The last field lay fallow. Young women were in the fields cutting flax and stuffing it in sacks thrown over their shoulders, while men weeded crops and threw up hay. The center of the village clustered along the main road near a little river, a tributary of the Burnham. Wood, stone, and wattle and daub buildings with shake or grass-thatched roofs lined the road, beginning just past the wooden bridge and ending halfway up the hillside toward the manor house. Between them were a variety of shops. From several buildings, smoke rose, the blackest of which came from the smithy. Their horses announced their arrival with a loud, hollow clop, clip, clop, as they crossed the bridge. Heads turned, each villager nudging the next, fingers pointing in their direction. Those they passed stopped what they were doing to follow, keeping a safe distance. "Good afternoon," Hadrian offered, but no one replied. No one smiled. Some whispered in the shelter of doorways. Mothers pulled children inside, and men picked up pitchforks or axes. "Is this where you grew up?" Arista whispered to Hadrian. "Somehow it seems more like how I would imagine Royce's hometown to be." This brought a look from Royce. "They don't get too many travelers here," Hadrian explained. "I can see why." They passed the mill where a great wooden wheel turned with the power of the river. The town also had a leatherworker's shop, a candle maker, a weaver, and even a shoemaker. They were halfway up the road when they reached the brewer. A heavy-set matron with gray hair and a hooked nose worked outside, beside a boiling vat, next to a stand of large wooden casks. She watched their slow approach, then walked to the middle of the road, wiping her hands on a soiled rag. "That'll be fair enough," she told them with a heavy South Province accent. She wore a stained apron tied around her shapeless dress, and a kerchief tied over her head. Her feet were bare, and her face was covered in dirt and sweat. "Who are you? And what's your business here? And be quick afore the hue and cry is called, and you carried to the bailiff. We don't stand for troublemakers here." "Hue and cry?" Arista softly asked. Hadrian looked over. "It's an alarm that everyone in the village responds to. Not a pretty sight." His eyes narrowed as he studied the woman. Then he slowly dismounted. The woman took a step back and grabbed hold of a mallet used to tap the kegs. "I said I'd call the hue and cry, and I meant it." Hadrian handed his reins to Royce and walked over to her. "If I remember correctly, you were the biggest troublemaker in the village, Armigill. And in close to 20 years, it doesn't seem much has changed." The woman looked surprised, then suspicious. "Hattie," she said in disbelief. "That can't be, can it?" Hadrian chuckled. "No one's called me Hattie in years." "Dear Maribor, how you've grown, lad." When the shock wore off, she set the mallet down and turned to the spectators now lining the road. "This here is Hattie Blackwater, the son of Danbury the smithy. Come back home." "How are you, Armigill?" Hadrian said with a broad smile, stepping forward to greet her. She replied by making a fist and punching him hard in the jaw. She had put all her weight into it and winced, shaking her hand in pain. "Ow, damned if you haven't got a hard, bloody jaw. Why'd you hit me?" Hadrian held his chin, stunned. "That's for running out on your father and leaving him to die alone. I've been waiting to do that for nearly 20 years. Hadrian licked blood from his lip and scowled. "Oh, get over it, you baby. And you better keep your eyes out for more round here. Danbury was a damn fine man, and you broke his heart the day you left." Hadrian continued to massage his jaw. Armigill rolled her eyes. "Come here," she ordered, and grabbed hold of his face. Hadrian flinched as she examined him. "You're fine? For Marybore's sake. Honestly, I thought your father made you tougher than that. If I had a sword in my hand, your shoulders would have less of a burden to carry, and the wee ones would have a new ball to kick round. Eh? Here, let me get you a mug of ale. This batch came of age this morning. That'll take the sting out of a warm welcome, it will." She walked to a large cask, filled a wooden cup with a dark amber draught, and handed it to him. Hadrian looked at the drink dubiously. "How many times have you filtered this?" "3, she said unconvincingly. "Has his lordship's taster passed this?" "Of course not, you damn fool. I just told you it got done fermenting this morning. Brewed it day afore yesterday, I did. A nice 2 days in the keg. Most of the sediment ought to have settled, and it should have a nice kick by now. Just don't want to get you into trouble. I ain't selling it to you now, am I? So drink it and shut up, or I'll hit you again for being daft." "Hattie, is it really you?" A thin man about Hadrian's age approached. He had shoulder-length blonde hair and a soft, doughy face. He was dressed in a worn gray tunic and a faded green cowl, his feet wrapped in cloth up to his knees. A light brown dust covered him, as if he had been burrowing through a sand hill. "Dunstan?" The man nodded and the two embraced, clapping each other on the shoulders. Wherever Hadrian patted Dunstan, a puff of brown powder arose, leaving the two in a little cloud. "You used to live here?" a little girl from the gathering crowd asked, and Hadrian nodded. This touched off a wave of conversations among those gathering in the street. More people rushed over, and Hadrian was enveloped in their midst. Eventually, he was able to get a word in and motioned toward Royce and Arista. "Everyone, this is my friend Mr. Everton and his wife, Irma." Arista and Royce exchanged glances. "Vince, Irma, this is the village brewmistress, Armigill. And Dunstan here is the baker's son." "Just the baker, Hattie. Dad's been dead 5 years now." "Oh, sorry to hear that, Dun. I've nothing but fond memories of trying to steal bread from his ovens." Dunstan looked at Royce. "Hattie and I were best friends when he lived here, until he disappeared," he said with a note of bitterness. "Will I have to endure a swing from you too?" Hadrian feigned fear. "You should. But I remember all too well the last time I fought you." Hadrian grinned wickedly as Dunstan scowled back. "If my foot hadn't slipped," Dunstan began, and then the two broke into spontaneous laughter at a joke no one else appeared to understand. "It's good to have you back, Hattie," he said sincerely. He watched Hadrian take a swallow of beer, and then to Armigill, he said, "I don't think it fair that Hattie gets a free pint, and I don't. Let me give you a bloody lip and you can have one too." She smiled at him. "Break it up! Break it up!" bellowed a large, muscular man, making his way through the crowd. He had a bull neck, a full dark beard, and a balding head. "Back to work, all of you." The crowd groaned in displeasure, but quickly quieted down as two horsemen approached. They rode down the hill, coming from the manor at a trot. "What's going on here?" the lead rider asked, reining his horse. He was a middle-aged man with weary eyes and a strong chin. He dressed in light, tailored linens, common to a favored servant, and on his chest was an embroidered crest of crossed daggers in gold threading. "Strangers, sir," the loud, bull-necked man replied. "They ain't strangers, sir," Armagill spoke up. "This here's Hattie Blackwater, son of the old village smith. Come for a visit." "Thank you, Armagill," he said, "but I wasn't speaking to you. I was addressing the Reeve." He looked down at the bearded man. "Well, Oscar, out with it." The burly man shrugged his shoulders and stroked his beard, looking uncomfortable. "She might be right, sir. I haven't had a chance to ask, what with getting the villains back to work and all." "Very well, Oscar. See to it that they return to work or I'll have you in stocks by nightfall." "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." He turned, bellowing at the villagers until they moved off. Only Armagill and Dunstan quietly remained behind. "Are you the son of the old smithy?" the rider asked. "I am," Hadrian replied. "And you are?" "I'm his lordship's bailiff. It's my duty to keep order in this village, and I don't appreciate you disrupting the villain's work." "My apologies, sir." Hadrian nodded respectfully. "I didn't mean—" "If you're the smithy's son, where have you been?" The other rider spoke this time. Much younger looking, he was better dressed than the bailiff, wearing a tunic of velvet and linen. His legs were covered in opaque hose and his feet in leather shoes with brass buckles. "Are you aware of the penalty for leaving the village without permission?" "I'm the son of a freeman, not a villain," Hadrian declared. "And who are you?" The rider sneered at Hadrian. "I am the imperial envoy to this village, and you would be wise to watch the tone of your voice. Freemen can lose that privilege easily." "Again, my apologies," Hadrian said. "I'm only here to visit my father's grave. He died while I was away." The envoy's eyes scanned Royce and Arista, then settled on Hadrian, looking him over carefully. "Three swords?" he asked the bailiff. "In this time of war, an able-bodied man like this should be in the army fighting for the Empress. He's likely a deserter or a rogue. Arrest him, seaward, and take his associates in for questioning. If he hasn't committed any crimes, he will be properly pressed into the Imperial Army." The bailiff looked at the envoy with annoyance. "I don't take my orders from you, Lurid. You forget that all too frequently. If you have a problem, take it up with the steward. I'm certain he will speak to his lordship the moment he returns from loyal service to the Empire. In the meantime, I'll administer this village as best I can for my lord, not for you." Lurid jerked himself upright in indignation. "As Imperial Envoy, I am addressed as Your Excellency, and you should understand that my authority comes directly from the Empress. I don't care if it comes from the good Lord F. Marable himself. Unless his lordship or the steward in his absence orders me otherwise, I only have to put up with you. I don't have to take orders from you." "We'll see about that." The envoy spun and spurred his horse back toward the manor, kicking up a cloud of dust. The bailiff shook his head with irritation, waiting for the dust to settle. "Don't worry," he told them. "The steward won't listen to him. Danbury Blackwater was a good man. If you're anything like him, you'll find me a friend. If not, you had best make your stay here as short as possible. Keep out of trouble. Don't interfere with the villain's work, and stay away from Lurid." "Thank you, sir," Hadrian said. The bailiff then looked around the village in irritation. "Armagill, where did the Reeve get off to?" "Went to the east field, I think, sir. There's a team he has working on drainage up that way." The bailiff sighed. I need him to get more men working on bringing in the hay. Rain's coming, and it'll ruin what's been cut if he doesn't. I'll tell him, sir, if he comes back this way. Thank you, Armigill, sir. She tapped off a pint of beer and handed it up to him. While you're here, sir. He took one swallow, then poured the rest out and tossed back her cup. A little weak, he said. Set your price at 2 copper tenons a pint. But sir, it's got good flavor. At least let me ask 3. He sighed. Why must you always be so damn stubborn? Let it be 3, but make them brimming pints. Mind you, if I hear one complaint, I'll fine you a silver, and you can take your case to the steward's court. Thank you, sir, she said, smiling. Good day to you all. He nodded and trotted off toward the east. They watched him go, and then Dunstan started chuckling. A fine welcome home you've had so far. A belt in the mouth, and threat of arrest. Actually, outside, the fact that everything looks a lot smaller, not much has changed here, Hadrian observed. Just some new faces, a few buildings, and of course the envoy. He's only been here a week, Dunstan said, and I'm sure the bailiff and the steward will be happy when he leaves. He travels a circuit covering a number of villages in the area and has been showing up here every couple of months since the new empire annexed Renyed. No one likes him, for obvious reasons. He's yet to meet Lord Baldwin face to face. Most of us think Baldwin purposely avoids being here when the envoy comes. So Lurit's list of complaints keeps getting longer and longer, and the steward just keeps writing them down. So are you really here just to see your father's grave? I thought you were coming back to stay. Sorry, Dun, but we're just passing through. In that case, we'd best make the most of it. What say you, Armigill? Roll a keg into my kitchen and I'll supply the bread and stools for toasts to Danbury and a proper welcome for Haddie. He don't deserve it, but I think I have a keg round here that is bound to go bad if and I don't get rid of it. Hobby, Dunstan shouted up the street to a young man at the livery. Can you find a place for these horses? Dunstan and Hadrian helped Armigill roll a small barrel to the bakery. As they did, Royce and Arista walked their animals over to the stables. The boy cleared 3 stalls, then ran off with a bucket to fetch water. Do you think the envoy will be a problem? Arista asked Royce, once Hobby had left. Don't know, he said, untying his pack from the saddle. Hopefully we won't be here long enough to find out. How long will we be here? Cosmos will move fast. Just a night or 2. I imagine. He threw his bag over his shoulder and crossed to Hadrian's horse. Have you decided what you'll say to Gaunt when you meet him? I hear he hates nobility, so I wouldn't start by asking him to kiss your ring or anything. She pulled her own gear off Mystic, and then holding out her hands, wiggled her bare fingers. Actually, I thought I'd ask him to kidnap my brother. She smiled. It worked for you. And if I can gain the trust and aid of a Royce Melbourne, how hard can it be to win over a Deegan Gaunt? They carried the gear across the street to the little whitewashed shop with a signboard portraying a loaf of bread. Inside, a huge brick oven and a large wooden table dominated the space. The comforting scent of bread and wood smoke filled the air, and Arista was surprised the bakery wasn't broiling. The wattle and daub walls and the good-sized windows managed to keep the room comfortable. As Arista and Royce entered, they were introduced to Dunstan's wife, Arbor, and a host of other people whose names Arista couldn't keep up with. Once word spread, freemen, farmers, and other merchants dropped by, grabbing a pint and helping themselves to a hunk of dark bread. There were Algar, the woodworker, Harbert, the tailor, and Harbert's wife, Hester. Hadrian introduced Wilfred, the carter, and explained how he used to rent Wilfred's little wagon 4 times every year to travel to Ratibor to buy iron ingots for his father's smithy. There were plenty of stories of the skinny kid with pimples who used to swing a hammer beside his father. Most remembered Danbury with kindness, and there were many toasts to his good name. Just as the bailiff had predicted, it started to rain, and soon the villains, released from work due to weather, dropped by to join the gathering. They slipped in, quietly shaking off the wetness. Each got a bit of bread, a pint to drink, and a spot to sit on the floor. Some brought steaming crocks of vegetable potage, cheese and cabbage for everyone to share. Even Osgar, the reeve, pressed himself inside and was welcomed to share the community meal. The sky darkened, the wind whipped up, and Dunstan finally closed the shutters as the rain poured. They all wanted to know what had happened to Hadrian, where he had gone, and what he had done. Most of them had spent their whole lives in Hintindar, barely crossing the river. In the case of the villains, they were bound to the land and by law couldn't leave. For them, generations passed without ever setting foot beyond the valley. Hadrian kept them entertained with stories of his travels. Arista was curious to hear tales of the adventures he and Royce had shared over the years. But none of those came out. Instead, he told harmless stories of distant lands. Everyone was spellbound by stories about the Far East, where the Kalayan people supposedly interbred with the Bahran gazelle to produce the half-goblin Tenkin. Children gathered close to the skirts of their mothers when he spoke about the Obadaza, Tenkin, who worshipped the dark god, Ubelin, and blended Kalayan traditions with gazelle magic. Even Arista was captivated by his stories of far-off Dagestan. With Hadrian the center of attention, few took notice of Arista, which was fine with her. She was happy just to be off her horse and in a safe place. The tension melted away from her. The hot bread and fresh brewed beer were wonderful. She was comfortable for the first time in days and reveled in the camaraderie of the bakery. She drank pints of beer until she lost track of the number. Outside, night fell and the rain continued. They lit candles, giving the room an even friendlier charm. The beer was infecting the group with mirth, and soon they were singing loudly. She didn't know the words, but found herself rocking with the rhythm, humming the chorus, and clapping her hands. Someone told a bawdy joke and the room burst into laughter. "Where are you from?" Although it had been asked 3 times, this was the first instance that Arista had realized it was meant for her. Turning, she found Arba, the baker's wife, sitting beside her. She was a petite woman with a plain face and short-cropped hair. "I'm sorry," Arista apologized. "I'm not accustomed to beer. The bailiff said it was weak, but I think I would take exception to that." From your mouth to his ears, darling, Armagill said loudly from across the room. Arista wondered how she had heard from so far away, especially when she had thought she had spoken so softly. Arista remembered Arba had asked a question. "Oh, right. Kulnora," the princess said at length. "My husband and I live in Kulnora. Well, actually, we are staying with my brother now because we were evicted from our home in Windham Village by the Northern Imperial Army. That's up in Warwick, you know. Windham Village, I mean not the army. Of course it could be. The army, I mean this time, not the village because they could be there. Does that answer your question?" The room was spinning slowly, and it gave Arista the feeling she was falling, though she knew she was sitting still. The whole sensation made it difficult for her to concentrate. "You were evicted? How awful." Arba looked stricken. "Well, yes, but it's not that great of a hardship, really. My brother has a very nice place in the hill district in Kulnora. He's quite well off, you know." She whispered this last part into Arba's ear. At least she thought she did. But Arba pulled back sharply. "Oh, really? You come from a wealthy family?" Arba asked, rubbing her ear. "I thought you did. I was admiring your dress. It's very beautiful." "This? Bah!" She pulled at the material of her skirt. "I got this old rag from one of my servants who was about to throw it out. You should see my gowns. Now those are something. But yes, we're very wealthy. My brother has a virtual army of servants," she said, and burst out laughing. "Irma," someone said from behind her. "What does your brother do?" Arba asked. Do? Oh, he doesn't do anything. He doesn't work. Irma, dear. My brother, he calls it work, but it's nothing like what you people do. Did you know I slept on the ground just 2 nights ago? Not indoors either, but out in the woods. My brother never did that. I can tell you. You probably have, haven't you? But he hasn't. No, he gets his money from taxes. That's how all kings get their money. Well, some can get it from conquest. Glen Morgan got loads from conquest, but not Ulrich. He's never been to war. Until now, of course. He's not doing well at all, I can tell you. Irma! Arista looked up to see Royce standing over her, his face stern. "Why are you calling me that?" "I think my wife has had a little too much to drink," he said to the rest of them. Arista looked around to see several faces smirking in an effort to suppress laughter. "Is there anywhere I can take her to sleep it off?" Immediately, several people offered the use of their homes, some even the use of their beds, saying they would sleep on the floor.